Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. What does it take for a quiet, often sickly boy from a respectable but unremarkable Roman family to become the single most powerful man in the Mediterranean world, and to do so not by wearing a crown, but by convincing an entire society that it still lived in a republic? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight, and what your local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the middle of the 1st century before Christ, the Roman Republic was outwardly strong and inwardly unsettled. Its armies had conquered lands from Spain to Syria. Grain flowed from North Africa. Marble temples rose beside older wooden shrines. Senators debated in the forum beneath the gaze of ancestral statues. Yet beneath this impressive surface lay a tension that everyone could sense. Generals had begun to command more loyalty from their soldiers than the Senate did. Wealth gathered in fewer hands. Elections were noisy, competitive, and often influenced by force. Old customs still existed, but they were increasingly strained by the scale of Rome's power. It was into this atmosphere that a child named Gaius Octavius was born in 63 BCE. His family belonged to the equestrian order, wealthy but not among the most ancient of Rome's noble houses. His father, also named Gaius Octavius, had risen through ability rather than lineage, serving as governor in Macedonia before his early death. His mother, Actium, came from a more distinguished line. She was the niece of Julius Caesar, a rising political figure whose ambition and energy were already widely discussed in Rome. Octavian's earliest years were spent not in grand palaces but in respectable homes that reflected a family moving steadily upward. Rome itself was a city of contrasts. Narrow streets twisted between tall apartment buildings called insulae, where ordinary citizens rented cramped rooms. Nearby stood domus, private houses arranged around quiet courtyards, with painted walls and small gardens. Markets opened at dawn. Bakers sold bread still warm from communal ovens. Water flowed from aqueducts into fountains where women filled clay jars. Slaves hurried on errands. Politicians moved through the crowds with attendants at their sides. As a child, Octavian was said to be thoughtful and reserved. He was not physically imposing. In fact, he often suffered from illnesses that left him pale and fatigued. These weaknesses shaped him in ways that were not immediately obvious. While other boys trained vigorously in wrestling and military exercises, he spent long hours in study. Roman education for a boy of his status involved grammar, rhetoric, and the memorization of history and law. He learned to read Latin and Greek texts, to recite poetry, and to practice the careful art of persuasion. The Roman world valued public speaking above almost every other skill. In a society where law courts were crowded and elections frequent, the ability to speak calmly and convincingly could determine a family's future. Octavian absorbed these lessons early. He watched older men practice gestures and pauses. He listened to debates in the forum. He learned that tone could be more powerful than volume, and that patience often achieved more than force. When his father died, Octavian was still young. His mother Actium played a significant role in guiding him. Roman households were structured firmly, but within those structures women could exert steady influence. Actium ensured that her son's education was thorough and that his connections were maintained. She also maintained contact with her uncle Julius Caesar, whose political career was advancing rapidly. Caesar at this time was not yet the dominant figure he would become, but he was already known for his boldness. He had served as consul, governed provinces, and commanded armies. His rivalry with Pompey and the Senate would eventually lead to civil war, but during Octavian's childhood these conflicts were still unfolding. The wider Roman society into which Octavian matured was filled with ceremony and expectation. Boys of noble families marked their transition into adulthood, with the donning of the toga virilis, the plain white garment symbolizing citizenship. Religious festivals punctuated the calendar. On certain days, citizens processed through the streets in honour of gods such as Jupiter or Mars. Public games, funded by ambitious politicians, filled amphitheatres with crowds eager for spectacle. Octavian grew accustomed to this rhythm of civic life. He observed how generosity in public works could secure loyalty. He saw how rumours could spread quickly through the markets. He understood that Rome was not governed only by laws, but by perception. As a teenager, he began to accompany his great-uncle Caesar on certain occasions. Caesar recognized in him a seriousness that contrasted with the extravagance of many young aristocrats. There was no immediate sign that this quiet youth would inherit anything extraordinary. Caesar had other potential heirs, and Roman politics was unpredictable. Yet he took an interest in Octavian's development. At 16, Octavian received military training. Although often unwell, he endured long marches and exercises. Roman commanders valued discipline above bravado. Soldiers were expected to build camps each night, dig trenches, and maintain equipment with care. Even brief exposure to such routines would have impressed upon him the structured efficiency that kept Roman legions effective. Meanwhile, events in the Republic accelerated. Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, defying the Senate and igniting civil war. Rome itself became tense. Senators fled. Armies manoeuvred across Italy and Greece. Ordinary citizens worried about food supplies and stability. Young Octavian observed these developments from a distance, aware that his family's fortunes were tied to the outcome. After Caesar defeated Pompey and consolidated power, he returned to Rome as dictator. His reforms were sweeping. He reorganized the calendar, settled veterans in colonies, and planned campaigns beyond Rome's existing frontiers. Statues were erected in his honour, yet not all Romans were comfortable. The Republic had prided itself on resisting kingship for centuries. The memory of Tarquin the Proud, the last Roman king expelled in ancient legend, still shaped political language. Octavian, during these years, was studying in Apollonia in Illyria, preparing for further service. Apollonia was a Greek city with orderly streets and philosophical schools. There he encountered not only military drills but also Hellenistic culture. Greek thought had long influenced Roman elites. Concepts of governance, ethics, and history were discussed in shaded courtyards. This environment broadened his perspective. He learned that power could be exercised subtly through institutions, rather than only through force. Then came the event that would change his life entirely. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Senate. The news travelled quickly across the Adriatic Sea. For a young man studying abroad, the announcement would have felt both distant and immediate. The leader who had shaped Rome's politics was suddenly gone, struck down by senators claiming to defend liberty. Shortly afterward, Octavian learned something even more astonishing. In his will, Caesar had adopted him posthumously as his son and named him heir. Adoption in Roman society was not unusual, especially among elite families seeking to secure succession. It transferred not only property but also name and status. By this act, the quiet youth became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. The implications were enormous. He was 18 years old. Rome was unstable. Caesar's assassins believed they had restored the Republic, yet they had not eliminated the loyalty Caesar commanded among soldiers and common citizens. The will also provided funds to be distributed to the Roman people, ensuring public interest in its execution. Octavian faced a choice that few teenagers would ever confront. He could remain in relative safety, or he could travel to Italy and claim his inheritance. The decision required calculation rather than impulse. He consulted advisors in Apollonia. He weighed the risks of confronting experienced generals and politicians. Ultimately, he chose to return. The voyage back to Italy marked the end of his childhood. He arrived not as a private citizen but as the adopted son of a murdered dictator. The streets of Rome were still tense. Funerals had stirred crowds. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally, had delivered a speech that inflamed public emotion. The assassins had retreated from the city, yet uncertainty remained. Octavian did not rush into confrontation. He moved carefully, meeting veterans who had served under Caesar. He reminded them of the promised distributions. He ensured that Caesar's will was honoured, paying the sums owed to citizens from his own resources when necessary. These actions were not dramatic gestures. They were steady steps designed to build legitimacy. In daily life, Rome continued its routines. Merchants opened stalls, senators met in curia, families celebrated marriages. Yet beneath these ordinary activities, alignments were forming. Antony controlled significant military forces. Other figures, such as Lepidus, held influence. Octavian, young and inexperienced in appearance, relied on careful alliances. His health remained fragile at times, but he compensated with endurance of another kind. He listened more than he spoke. He cultivated an image of dutiful son avenging his father. In a society where family honour was central, this role resonated. He did not declare himself king or ruler. Instead, he framed his actions as service to Caesar's memory and to Rome. The broader Mediterranean world was watching. Provinces needed stable administration. Tax collection had to continue. Governors sought clarity about whom to obey. Octavian understood that Rome's strength lay in its network of obligations and offices. If he could position himself within that framework rather than above it, he would gain acceptance. His early months in Italy were a study in restraint. He avoided reckless statements. He attended public ceremonies. He consulted experienced men while gradually asserting independence. Those who dismissed him as a youth underestimated the patience he had cultivated since childhood. At home, his mother Actium and his stepfather Philippus offered guidance. Roman family life emphasized obedience and respect, yet it also involved negotiation of expectations. Actium likely understood that her son's path would be dangerous. Still, ambition in Rome was rarely discouraged when it promised honour. By the end of his 19th year, Octavian had secured recognition from Caesar's veterans and begun to position himself as a political actor. The Senate, wary of Antony's power, saw potential in balancing one ambitious figure against another. This dynamic would shape the next phase of his life. For now, though, he remained a young man navigating a city where memory and ambition intertwined. He walked streets paved with stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. He passed temples dedicated to gods whose favour Romans invoked before every undertaking. He saw inscriptions honouring ancestors who had defended the Republic. All of this history surrounded him, reminding him that Rome valued continuity even in times of upheaval. The boy, once known simply as Octavius, had stepped into a role that required composure beyond his years. He had no illusions about the fragility of power. Illness had taught him limits. Study had taught him method. Family ties had placed him at the centre of events. From this point forward, his life would unfold in close connection with the fate of the Republic itself. Yet at this early stage, he was not yet Augustus. He was a young Roman carrying a new name, learning how to move within structures older than himself. The transformation from uncertain heir to architect of empire would take decades. It would involve alliances, reforms, and steady recalibration of authority. For now, the story rests with a youth standing at the edge of responsibility, aware that Rome's future, and his own, were quietly converging. Caesar's shadow. In the months following his return to Italy, the young man now called Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus began to understand that inheritance in Rome was not secured by parchment alone. Caesar's will had given him a name, property, and a claim, but it had not granted him obedience. Authority in the Republic flowed through networks of loyalty, soldiers to generals, clients to patrons, voters to benefactors, and these ties had to be renewed continually. Octavian stepped into a landscape where every bond was being tested. The memory of Julius Caesar lingered everywhere. His image had appeared on coins during his lifetime, a striking innovation in a state that had long avoided elevating living men in such a way. His statue stood in the Forum, Veterans who had marched under him still carried stories of long campaigns in Gaul, of harsh winters and decisive battles. Ordinary citizens remembered distributions of grain and public entertainments funded from his victories. The assassins had claimed to restore liberty, yet they had not dismantled the expectations Caesar had created. Octavian understood that he could not imitate his adoptive father's boldness too quickly. He lacked experience, and he lacked troops under direct command. Instead, he placed himself deliberately in Caesar's shadow. He emphasized his filial duty. He adopted the name Caesar in full, signaling continuity. In public appearances, he dressed with restraint. He did not attempt to dominate gatherings through theatrical gestures. He allowed others to speak first, observing how alliances shifted. Mark Antony at this time held the consulship and controlled significant military resources. He had been Caesar's colleague and ally, and he considered himself the natural leader of the Caesarian faction. Antony's temperament differed sharply from Octavian's. He was older, seasoned in warfare, and accustomed to commanding attention. He valued displays of strength and generosity. To many soldiers, he embodied the familiar style of a Roman general. The Senate, composed largely of aristocrats wary of both men, attempted to navigate between them. Some senators hoped to use Octavian as a counterweight to Antony. They praised his youth and spoke of restoring constitutional norms, yet their support was cautious. They did not wish to create another figure as dominant as Caesar had been. During this period, Rome's daily life continued with a mixture of routine and apprehension. Vendors in the Forum sold olives, fish sauce, and woven garments. Couriers carried messages between provinces. Magistrates supervised markets and public order. The Tiber flowed steadily past its embankments, carrying barges laden with grain. At temples, priests performed sacrifices according to the calendar. Citizens discussed politics in bathhouses, where heated rooms offered relief from the noise of the streets. Octavian made careful use of Caesar's bequests. The will had promised each Roman citizen a sum of money. Antony had initially resisted full payment, citing financial strain. Octavian chose to honour the pledge, even at personal cost. By selling portions of his inherited estate and borrowing funds, he distributed the promised amounts. This action resonated deeply. In a society attentive to generosity, fulfilling such obligations demonstrated reliability. At the same time, Octavian cultivated relationships with veterans settled in Italy. These men had served under Caesar and expected land grants. Their loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be maintained. Octavian visited colonies where veterans resided, speaking with them directly. He emphasized his status as Caesar's son and pledged to protect their interests. His manner was measured. He listened to complaints about land disputes and administrative delays. These interactions were practical rather than dramatic, but they built a base of support that would prove crucial. Meanwhile, tensions between Antony and the Senate escalated. The assassins of Caesar, including Brutus and Cassius, had withdrawn to the eastern provinces, gathering forces. The Republic stood divided not simply between two men, but among several centres of power. Armies were being assembled in different regions. Governors weighed their allegiances. Octavian's position required patience. He was elected to certain offices earlier than usual, benefiting from his status and from political manoeuvring. Though technically underage for high magistracies, he secured extraordinary privileges through senatorial decrees. These exceptions indicated how fluid the constitutional order had become. Rules designed for stability were bent in response to crisis. He also began to surround himself with advisors who would remain central throughout his life. One of these was Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a friend from his youth. Agrippa possessed military skill and organizational talent. Unlike some aristocrats, he did not seek the spotlight. His loyalty to Octavian was steady. In Rome's competitive environment, such reliability was rare and valuable. Another figure who entered Octavian's circle was Maecenas, known for cultural refinement and diplomatic ability. Though not a traditional military leader, Maecenas would later play an essential role in shaping public opinion and patronizing the arts. At this stage, however, his primary function was to help navigate political currents with discretion. The broader Mediterranean world was unsettled. In Gaul and Spain, legions awaited direction. In the east, Brutus and Cassius organized resistance, drawing upon resources from wealthy provinces. Trade continued, but uncertainty affected prices and credit. Moneylenders hesitated to extend loans without clarity about the future. Octavian's health occasionally faltered, reminding him of his physical limitations. During bouts of illness, he relied more heavily on trusted associates. Yet these periods also reinforced his preference for planning rather than impulsive action. He learned to delegate, to conserve energy, and to think beyond immediate confrontations. By 43 BCE, conflict between Antony and the Senate erupted into open warfare. The consuls of that year led armies against Antony near Mutina in northern Italy. Octavian, aligned temporarily with the Senate, commanded troops as well. The campaign was chaotic. Both consuls were killed in battle. Antony retreated, but the outcome did not restore stability. Instead, it revealed the fragility of senatorial leadership. With the consuls dead, Octavian found himself in command of significant forces. He marched toward Rome, not as a conqueror, but as a political actor asserting his claim. The Senate, recognizing the reality of his support among soldiers, granted him the consulship despite his youth. This step marked a decisive shift. He was no longer merely Caesar's heir, he was an office holder within the Republic. Yet alliances in Rome rarely remained fixed. Realizing that prolonged conflict among Caesarian factions would benefit the assassins in the east, Octavian negotiated with Antony and Lepidus. The result was the formation of the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE, a legally established three-man commission for restoring the state. Unlike earlier informal alliances, this arrangement had formal authority backed by law. The Triumvirate represented a turning point. It combined military power with legal sanction. Its first major act was the issuance of proscriptions, lists of individuals declared enemies of the state, whose property could be confiscated and whose lives were forfeit. These measures were harsh and far-reaching. Wealthy senators, equestrians, and political opponents were targeted. The aim was both to eliminate rivals and to raise funds for the coming campaigns. Among the victims was Cicero, the renowned orator who had criticized Antony. His death symbolized the cost of political upheaval. Rome's streets witnessed seizures of property and hurried departures of those fearing inclusion on the lists. For ordinary citizens, these events underscored how precarious security had become. Octavian participated in these decisions, though later he would distance himself from their severity. At the time, he was operating within a system that equated survival with decisive action. The triumvirs needed resources to confront Brutus and Cassius, who controlled the eastern provinces and commanded substantial armies. Daily life adjusted to this new authority. Notices bearing the names of the triumvirs were posted publicly. Taxation increased to fund military operations. Craftsmen supplied weapons and equipment. Families worried about relatives serving in distant legions. Religious ceremonies were performed seeking favourable omens for campaigns soon to unfold. In 42 BCE, the triumvirs marched east to confront the assassins at Philippi in Macedonia. Octavian, still young and often ill, did not command with the physical vigour of Antony. During parts of the campaign, he was confined by sickness, yet his presence mattered symbolically. The forces of Caesar's heir faced those who had claimed to defend the Republic. The battles of Philippi ended with the defeat of Brutus and Cassius, who took their own lives rather than face capture. This outcome removed the immediate opposition that had justified the triumvirate's formation. Yet victory did not resolve underlying tensions between Octavian and Antony. After Philippi, the Roman world was divided between them. Antony took responsibility for the East, rich in resources and complex in politics. Octavian returned to Italy to manage the West and settle veterans on land. This task was delicate. Confiscating property from Italian landowners to provide farms for soldiers created resentment. Protests arose in certain regions. Octavian had to balance promises made to veterans with the need to maintain broader stability. In these years, he learned that governance involved more than military triumph. It required managing expectations, adjudicating disputes, and maintaining supply lines. Grain shipments from Sicily were vital to Rome's population. When Sextus Pompey, son of Pompey the Great, disrupted these routes with naval forces, shortages threatened unrest. Octavian relied on Agrippa to rebuild and strengthen the fleet, preparing for eventual confrontation. Within Rome itself, cultural life persisted. Poets composed verses reflecting on civil war and longing for peace. Artisans decorated homes with frescoes depicting mythological scenes. Public baths offered spaces where citizens of various classes mingled. The memory of republican traditions coexisted with the reality of concentrated power. Octavian's personal life also evolved. He entered into political marriages that reinforced alliances. Such unions in Rome were often strategic rather than romantic. They connected families and secured support. Through these relationships, he navigated social networks that extended beyond formal offices. Throughout this period, he continued to cultivate an image of moderation. He avoided ostentatious displays. He presented himself as restoring order, rather than seeking domination. This distinction, subtle yet consistent, began to shape perceptions. Many Romans were weary of civil war. Stability, even under strong leadership, seemed preferable to endless factionalism. The shadow of Julius Caesar remained both an asset and a caution. Caesar's overt accumulation of honours had alarmed senators. Octavian observed how quickly admiration could turn into fear. He resolved to move carefully, to adopt forms that preserved the appearance of republican governance, even as he accumulated influence. By the late 30s BCE, the partnership between Octavian and Antony was strained. Their responsibilities in different regions led to divergent interests. Communication across the Mediterranean was slow. Rumours travelled faster than official messages. Antony's association with Cleopatra in Egypt would soon become a focal point of contention. For now, however, Octavian continued to consolidate his position in the West. He strengthened administrative structures, ensured tax collection, and expanded his network of loyal commanders. Each step was measured. Each decision reflected lessons learned since childhood. That patience could outlast spectacle, and that legitimacy rested on fulfilling obligations as much as on winning battles. The young man who had once stood uncertain in Rome's crowded streets had grown into a central figure in its political landscape. He still faced rivals, still navigated shifting alliances, but he had moved beyond the role of heir. He was shaping events rather than merely responding to them. In these early years under Caesar's shadow, Octavian learned that power in Rome required both memory and adaptation. He honoured his adoptive father's name while avoiding his mistakes. He balanced firmness with restraint. He allowed institutions to continue functioning even as he influenced them from within. The Republic had not yet transformed into an empire, but the foundations were being laid quietly. The habits formed in these formative years, careful planning, reliance on trusted allies, attention to public perception, would define his later rule. For now, the narrative moves forward with a young leader consolidating authority in a world still unsettled, preparing for the challenges that would determine not only his fate, but the structure of Roman governance for generations. Heir to a murder. By the time the alliance of three had secured its legal footing, Rome had already grown accustomed to sudden turns of fortune. Yet nothing, in its long history, had prepared it for the transformation of a private teenager into the adopted son of a slain dictator. The shock of Julius Caesar's assassination did not fade quickly. His blood had dried on the Senate floor, but the memory lingered in public speech, in private meals, and in the quiet calculations of every ambitious man. When Octavian first read the formal copy of Caesar's will, he encountered more than a personal inheritance. Roman adoption was a serious civic act. It transferred a man fully into a new family line, including ancestral rights and responsibilities. By naming Octavian as his son, Caesar had altered the boy's identity at its root. He was no longer merely Gaius Octavius of an equestrian house. He was now legally Gaius Julius Caesar, heir to a name that carried both admiration and resentment. In Rome, names mattered. They signalled lineage, political alliances, and expectations. The addition of Caesar placed a weight on Octavian's shoulders that could not be set aside. Supporters of Caesar saw in him continuity. Opponents saw a threat reborn. The city's narrow streets carried whispers that measured his posture, his words, even his clothing, searching for signs of ambition or hesitation. The immediate aftermath of the assassination had been chaotic. Caesar's body was brought to the Forum, where Mark Antony delivered a funeral oration that stirred public emotion. The crowd reacted strongly against the conspirators, forcing many of them to leave the city, yet the assassins had not been formally condemned. The Senate attempted to preserve a fragile compromise, granting amnesty while confirming Caesar's acts. Rome hovered between grief and uncertainty. Octavian entered this atmosphere without dramatics. He did not march with banners or announce sweeping reforms. Instead, he visited key individuals one by one. He met senators who had supported Caesar, veterans stationed near Italy, and influential equestrians whose wealth shaped credit markets. He reminded each group that Caesar's will must be respected. By framing his actions as obedience to legal documents rather than personal ambition, he positioned himself within accepted norms. The distribution of funds promised to Roman citizens became an early test. Caesar had left each citizen 75 denarii, a meaningful sum for many families. When delays threatened this payment, Octavian stepped forward to fulfill the promise. He sold portions of his inherited estates and borrowed heavily. This act was costly but calculated. In Rome, generosity was not forgotten. The citizens who received their share associated the fulfillment with Caesar's son rather than with the Senate or Antony. Meanwhile, the assassins Brutus and Cassius, foremost among them, gathered strength in the eastern provinces. They presented themselves as defenders of liberty, drawing support from cities wary of dictatorship. They controlled substantial resources, including legions loyal to their cause. The Republic, once united under shared institutions, now resembled a patchwork of competing commands. Octavian's youth remained a subject of debate. Some senators dismissed him as inexperienced, a convenient symbol to counterbalance Antony. Others feared that beneath his reserved demeanour lay determination equal to Caesar's. He did not respond publicly to such speculation. Instead, he secured formal recognition of his adoption and pressed for political offices that would legitimize his position. At 19, he sought the consulship. According to tradition, this highest annual office required a minimum age far beyond his own. Yet Rome's traditions were already under strain. Backed by legions and by supporters who valued his connection to Caesar, he compelled the Senate to bend its rules. In 43 BCE, he was elected consul. This unprecedented advancement signalled that extraordinary times had redefined what was possible. With the consulship, he gained authority to propose legislation and command troops legally. He moved to ensure that Caesar's assassins were formally condemned as murderers. Laws were passed declaring them enemies of the state. The language of legality framed what was essentially a civil conflict. By embedding these measures in decrees, Octavian aligned himself with Roman procedure even as he prepared for war. The formation of the Second Triumvirate followed soon after. Octavian, Antony and Lepidus met near Bologna and agreed upon a structured alliance. Unlike previous informal coalitions, this one was codified through law as a board of 3 men empowered to restore order. Their authority superseded that of ordinary magistrates. The Republic's traditional offices continued to exist, but ultimate power now rested with this commission. One of their earliest and most controversial actions was the proscription. Lists of names were posted publicly. Those included were declared outlaws. Their properties were confiscated, their deaths rewarded. The measure served two purposes: eliminating political rivals and raising funds for campaigns. For families whose names appeared, the consequences were immediate and severe. Some fled to distant provinces. Others were betrayed by associates seeking rewards. Octavian participated in these decisions alongside Antony and Lepidus. The necessity of financing war against Brutus and Cassius provided justification. Yet the atmosphere in Rome grew heavy. Wealth changed hands rapidly. Houses once belonging to prominent families were sold. The Forum saw hurried transactions as estates were redistributed. Fear mingled with opportunity. Cicero's execution marked a poignant moment. Once a champion of republican oratory, he had criticized Antony sharply. His inclusion on the proscription list reflected the harsh logic of survival among the triumvirs. For many observers, his death symbolized the passing of an older political culture rooted in debate rather than armed authority. Amid these upheavals, daily routines persisted. Bakers rose before dawn. Artisans shaped metal and clay. Children recited lessons in schools. Religious observances continued, though with prayers increasingly focused on peace and stability. The contrast between ordinary life and extraordinary politics was striking. Rome's citizens adapted because adaptation had long been part of their history. In 42 BCE, the triumvirs set out to confront Brutus and Cassius in Macedonia. The campaign culminated in 2 battles near Philippi. Antony displayed tactical skill and aggressive leadership. Octavian, often ill during this period, relied on subordinates and on Agrippa's emerging talents. Despite physical weakness, he maintained presence among the troops, reinforcing his claim as Caesar's heir. The defeat of the assassins ended one chapter of civil war but opened another. With their opponents gone, the triumvirs faced the challenge of governing without a unifying enemy. They divided responsibilities. Antony took the eastern provinces, rich and culturally complex. Octavian returned to Italy and the western territories. Lepidus received Africa but soon receded in influence. Octavian's task in Italy was formidable. Thousands of veterans expected land grants promised during recruitment. Providing these settlements required confiscating property from Italian communities. Resistance arose in certain towns, leading to tensions and occasional unrest. Octavian sought to implement allocations methodically, minimizing conflict where possible, yet the process inevitably generated resentment. He approached the challenge as administrator rather than conqueror. Surveyors measured fields, officials recorded transfers. Disputes were heard in local assemblies. Though not free from hardship, the process reflected a commitment to structured governance. Veterans settled on farms, formed new communities tied to Octavian's leadership. At the same time, Sextus Pompey controlled naval forces in Sicily, threatening grain shipments to Rome. The city's population depended heavily on imported grain. Shortages could provoke unrest quickly. Octavian recognized the strategic importance of sea power. He entrusted Agrippa with rebuilding the fleet, establishing training facilities, and preparing for confrontation. In these years, Octavian's personal habits revealed consistency. He maintained a relatively modest household compared to some contemporaries. He valued routine, rising early and reviewing reports methodically. Though capable of decisive action, he preferred gradual consolidation to sudden leaps. Those who worked closely with him noted his attention to detail and his willingness to consult advisors. His marriages during this period reflected political calculation. Alliances with influential families strengthened his network. Roman aristocratic society was interwoven through such unions. Women in these families often acted as intermediaries, maintaining communication between houses. Through marriage, Octavian embedded himself more deeply in Rome's elite structure. As Antony established himself in the east, forming alliances and engaging with local rulers, differences in style became apparent. Antony's approach emphasized personal presence and grandeur. He spent time in Alexandria, engaging with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. News of these activities reached Rome through letters and reports, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes accurate. Octavian observed carefully. He did not attack Antony immediately. Instead, he focused on stabilizing Italy, strengthening his military resources, and presenting himself as guardian of Roman traditions. He understood that public opinion could shape outcomes as effectively as legions. The Senate continued to function, passing decrees and overseeing magistracies, yet real authority rested with those who commanded armies. Octavian sought to integrate his power into formal structures rather than override them. By holding offices legally, by respecting certain customs, he differentiated himself from overt dictatorship. Throughout these developments, the memory of Caesar's murder remained a touchstone. Octavian invoked it when justifying actions against the assassins. He emphasized that he acted to avenge a father and restore order. This narrative resonated with many who valued family loyalty and stability. The young heir had thus navigated a path from uncertainty to central authority within a few years. His transformation was not marked by theatrical proclamations, but by steady accumulation of roles and responsibilities. He learned to balance firmness with moderation, severity with clemency when advantageous. Rome itself was changing. Civil war had altered expectations. Citizens who once prized competitive elections above all began to value peace more highly. Merchants desired stable trade routes. Farmers sought protection from confiscation. Veterans expected rewards for service. Octavian positioned himself as the figure capable of meeting these diverse needs. By the late 30 spies BCE, he stood not merely as heir to a murdered leader, but as a political force shaping the Mediterranean's future. The Republic's forms persisted, yet its substance was shifting. Octavian's measured approach, honed under the weight of inheritance, prepared him for the confrontation that would define the next stage of his life. The story continues with a young statesman who had accepted the burden of a name and transformed it into a foundation for authority. Each decision built upon the last. Each alliance extended his reach. The shadow of Caesar had once loomed over him. Now it served as a framework within which he crafted his own identity. The Republic, though still named as such, was gradually adapting to a new reality, one in which the heir to a murder would become architect of a different order. A teenager among generals. When Octavian first stood in formal assembly as consul, still not yet 20 years old, he did so among men who had commanded legions longer than he had worn a toga of adulthood. Rome had always valued experience in war and politics, and many of the Republic's most respected figures had earned authority through decades of service. Octavian's presence among them was therefore unusual, even unsettling, yet it reflected a deeper truth about the late Republic. Rules had begun to bend around force and necessity. The Senate House, rebuilt and adorned under successive leaders, remained the symbolic heart of Roman governance. Marble columns supported its structure. Bronze doors opened onto a chamber where debates could shape the fate of provinces. Octavian entered this space not as a subordinate observer, but as one of the presiding magistrates. His youth contrasted sharply with the lined faces of older senators, some of whom remembered earlier civil wars. He understood that he would be judged not only on policy, but on composure. He spoke with care. His rhetoric avoided flamboyance. He appealed to precedent, to legal forms, and to the need for order. This restraint was deliberate. Among generals who valued spectacle, a quiet tone could signal seriousness rather than weakness. By positioning himself as defender of procedure, he gained support from those anxious about open dictatorship. Outside the Senate, the city continued its layered existence. The Forum bustled with traders. News of decisions travelled quickly along its stone pavements. In nearby basilicas, financial disputes were settled. At the Circus Maximus, chariot races drew cheering crowds. Rome's population, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, required constant provisioning. Water from aqueducts supplied fountains and baths. Grain shipments were unloaded at Ostia and transported upriver. Administration was as vital as legislation. Octavian's relationship with soldiers deepened during this period. Legions that had served Caesar remained central to his power. Military camps outside Rome and across Italy functioned as structured communities. Soldiers rose at dawn, drilled with discipline, and maintained equipment with precision. Their loyalty depended on trust in leadership and expectation of reward. Octavian visited camps, reviewed troops, and addressed grievances. Though not known for battlefield theatrics, he demonstrated reliability in payment and settlement. His friendship with Agrippa grew in importance. Agrippa possessed practical intelligence and adaptability. While Octavian managed political messaging in Rome, Agrippa oversaw logistical details. He supervised shipbuilding, troop movements, and engineering projects. Their partnership reflected complementary strengths, one focused on perception and legitimacy, the other on execution. The triumvirate's authority was set to last 5 years, and during that time Octavian and Antony maintained a careful balance. Yet friction simmered. Italy's land distributions created resentment among dispossessed landowners. Some local leaders resisted confiscations. Rebellions flared briefly, requiring military intervention. Octavian learned that victory over distant enemies did not guarantee peace at home. In 41 BCE, tensions escalated when Fulvia, Antony's wife, and Lucius Antonius, his brother, opposed Octavian's settlement policies. They raised forces in Italy, claiming to defend traditional rights. The resulting conflict, often called the Perusine War, ended with Octavian's siege of Perusia. The city eventually surrendered. Though he spared many inhabitants, the episode revealed how fragile alliances remained. The winter following the siege was harsh. Italy's rural communities adjusted to new owners of farmland. Veterans adapted to agricultural routines, many learning cultivation after years in camp. Markets adjusted to shifts in property and production. Octavian oversaw these transitions with administrative focus, seeking to prevent further unrest. In the east, Antony was engaged in campaigns and diplomatic arrangements. His alliance with Cleopatra strengthened during these years. Reports of lavish ceremonies in Alexandria circulated in Rome. Cleopatra, educated and politically astute, sought security for Egypt's independence. Antony saw strategic advantage in partnership with her kingdom's resources, yet Roman opinion could be sensitive to perceived foreign influence. Octavian paid attention to these narratives. He did not yet launch open criticism, but he understood their potential. Roman identity had long been shaped in contrast to Eastern monarchies. Even subtle suggestions that Antony embraced foreign customs could influence sentiment in Italy. At home, Octavian cultivated a different image. He emphasized traditional Roman values. He sponsored public games and religious observances. Temples were repaired or newly dedicated. These acts were not mere decoration. They reinforced continuity with ancestral practice. In a society where religion and politics were intertwined, such gestures affirmed legitimacy. Sextus Pompey remained a significant challenge. Controlling Sicily and parts of the Mediterranean, he disrupted grain shipments and provided refuge for political exiles. His naval strength threatened Rome's food supply. Shortages led to price increases, causing unease among the urban population. Octavian recognized that control of the sea was essential. Agrippa undertook an ambitious naval program. Harbours were constructed and crews trained intensively. New ships were designed with reinforced structures suitable for Mediterranean combat. Training emphasized coordination and endurance. The process required resources and patience. Octavian supported it consistently, understanding that success at sea would secure both food supply and political standing. In 39 BCE, a temporary peace was arranged with Sextus Pompey through the Pact of Misenum. It granted him control of certain territories in exchange for restoring grain shipments. The agreement provided breathing room, but did not resolve underlying rivalry. Octavian used the interval to strengthen his position further. Social life in Rome during these years reflected both recovery and adaptation. Wealthy families hosted dinners featuring courses of fish, vegetables, and imported delicacies. Guests reclined on couches, discussing politics and poetry. Freedmen engaged in trade, rising in prosperity. Slaves performed domestic labour, some managing complex household accounts. The diversity of roles sustained the urban economy. Octavian's own household was organised but not extravagant. He preferred routine over indulgence. He rose early, reviewed correspondence from governors, and consulted with advisers. His health remained variable. Bouts of illness reminded him to conserve energy. This limitation shaped his leadership style, favouring planning and delegation. By 36 BCE, conflict with Sextus Pompey resumed. Agrippa's fleet engaged in decisive battles near Sicily. Victory gradually tilted toward Octavian's forces. Sextus fled and was eventually captured and executed. Control of the western Mediterranean was secured. Grain shipments stabilised, easing urban anxiety. The removal of Sextus also reduced the number of powerful independent commanders. Lepidus, whose influence had already waned, attempted to assert authority in Sicily but was sidelined. Octavian stripped him of significant power, leaving him with the religious office of Pontifex Maximus but little political weight. The Triumvirate effectively narrowed to two dominant figures, Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. As Octavian consolidated Italy and the western provinces, he invested in infrastructure. Roads were repaired to facilitate communication and trade. Veterans' colonies were integrated into administrative networks. Tax systems were standardized. Such measures rarely attracted dramatic attention, yet they strengthened governance. Public perception continued to matter deeply. Octavian avoided overt displays of monarchy. He declined certain honours that might provoke comparison to kings. He presented himself as servant of the state, even as he commanded legions. This careful balancing act distinguished him from Caesar's final months, when honours had accumulated rapidly. Meanwhile, Antony's activities in the east grew more intertwined with Cleopatra's ambitions. He distributed territories to her children and participated in ceremonies that some Romans viewed as adopting Eastern royal styles. These actions, though politically motivated within the Eastern context, provided Octavian with material for future argument. Within Rome, cultural production flourished cautiously. Poets such as Virgil began composing works reflecting on Rome's destiny and longing for peace. Artistic patronage gradually aligned with Octavian's circle. Maecenas encouraged literary talent, shaping narratives that emphasized stability and renewal. Octavian's understanding of image extended beyond rhetoric. He commissioned coinage bearing his likeness and titles, circulated across provinces. Coins served as miniature messages, communicating authority in markets and military camps alike. By controlling imagery, he influenced perception far beyond Rome. The relationship between Octavian and Antony deteriorated steadily. Though bound by earlier agreements and even by marriage ties, Antony had married Octavian's sister, Octavia. Their interests diverged. Diplomatic exchanges grew tense. Reports from the east fueled suspicion. Each leader assessed the loyalty of legions and allies. In Italy, Octavian prepared methodically. He ensured that troops were well supplied and commanders aligned with his strategy. He fostered loyalty through consistent payment and attention to veterans' concerns. His approach contrasted with Antony's more charismatic style. Octavian relied less on personal magnetism and more on institutional control. The Roman public, weary from years of upheaval, increasingly valued stability. Markets thrived when trade routes were secure. Festivals were more joyful when food was plentiful. Octavian positioned himself as guardian of this fragile calm. He did not claim extraordinary titles yet, but his influence was unmistakable. As the 30s BCE progressed, the Republic's transformation accelerated. The structures remained, but their function shifted. Consuls still took office annually, yet major decisions flowed from the two dominant leaders. Provincial governors awaited direction from them. Armies responded to their commands. Octavian, once the teenager navigating inheritance, had matured into a statesman commanding respect among seasoned generals. He had survived internal rebellions, secured the Western Mediterranean, and built networks of loyalty. He stood poised for the confrontation that would determine Rome's direction. Yet at this stage his power was still framed within republican forms. He continued to attend Senate meetings, propose legislation, and observe rituals. The outward appearance of continuity reassured many citizens. Beneath it, a new structure was quietly emerging, shaped by a man who had learned early to value patience over spectacle. The narrative advances toward the inevitable clash with Antony, but for now, it rests on a portrait of disciplined consolidation. The teenager among generals had become their equal not through flamboyance, but through steady accumulation of trust and authority. Rome, adapting once more to altered realities, watched as its future took shape in measured steps rather than sudden leaps. The Second Triumvirate. By the middle years of the 40s BCE, the Roman Republic no longer functioned according to the assumptions that had guided it for centuries. Magistracies were still filled, elections were still held, and the Senate still convened beneath painted ceilings and ancestral masks. Yet real authority now rested with a small group of men who commanded armies and shaped legislation through force backed by law. The Second Triumvirate Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus stood at the centre of this arrangement. Unlike earlier political alliances, this was not an informal understanding. It had been granted legal status through the Lex Titiae in 43 BCE, empowering the three men to restore the Republic. The phrase itself was revealing. It implied that the Republic had strayed and required correction. In practice, the triumvirs exercised powers that surpassed ordinary magistrates. They could nominate officials, enact laws, and assign provinces without traditional checks. The justification was temporary necessity. The effect was structural change. For Octavian, participation in this arrangement required balancing ambition with calculation. He was still younger than his colleagues. Antony had commanded legions across Gaul and the East. Lepidus had experience and religious authority. Yet Octavian possessed something distinct: the name of Caesar and the loyalty of veterans who had served under him. The triumvirate allowed him to operate on equal legal footing with older, seasoned commanders. The first acts of the triumvirate were severe. The prescriptions were expanded and enforced rigorously. Lists of targeted individuals were posted in public spaces. Property was seized to finance military campaigns. Families were uprooted. The scale of confiscations reshaped Rome's economic landscape. Estates changed hands. Urban houses were reassigned. Though harsh, these measures filled the treasury at a moment when vast sums were required to fund armies moving east. Octavian participated in drafting and approving these lists, though later accounts would emphasize his reluctance. At the time, survival demanded cohesion among the three leaders. To hesitate would have signaled weakness. Each triumvir made concessions regarding which associates might be spared or sacrificed. Political calculation often overrode personal sentiment. The Roman populace adapted with resilience born of long experience. Shopkeepers continued their trade even as ownership of surrounding buildings shifted. Public ceremonies honoured traditional gods. Children attended lessons. Slaves maintained households whose masters had been replaced. The city had endured previous turmoil. It endured this as well. With resources secured, the triumvirs prepared for the eastern campaign against Brutus and Cassius. The march to Philippi required coordination across sea and land. Ships transported troops from Italy to Macedonia. Supply lines stretched over long distances. Octavian, though often physically unwell during the campaign, ensured that administrative details were addressed. Agrippa and other commanders oversaw movements with efficiency. The battles at Philippi in 42 BCE ended with the defeat of the assassins. Antony's tactical leadership proved decisive, while Octavian's presence reinforced symbolic continuity with Caesar. The suicides of Brutus and Cassius removed the last organised defenders of the old republican cause. Rome's political field narrowed further. After victory, The triumvirs faced the challenge of governing an empire without a unifying enemy. The Mediterranean world was vast, encompassing diverse cultures, languages, and traditions. Effective administration required division of responsibility. Antony assumed control of the eastern provinces, where wealth and complex diplomacy awaited. Octavian took charge of Italy and the western territories. Lepidus was assigned Africa but gradually lost influence. Octavian's responsibilities in Italy were immediate and demanding. Veterans expected land as reward for service. Allocating territory required surveying fields, adjudicating disputes, and sometimes displacing established landowners. Resistance surfaced in certain towns. Tensions flared into open conflict during the Parisine War, when Lucius, Antonius, and Fulvia opposed Octavian's settlement policies. The siege of Perusia ended with surrender, reinforcing Octavian's authority in Italy. The settlement of veterans reshaped the social fabric of the peninsula. Colonies were established in strategic locations. Former soldiers transitioned into farmers and local leaders. Their loyalty to Octavian persisted, linking rural communities to his political fortunes. These settlements also created networks of influence extending beyond Rome's urban centre. Meanwhile, Sextus Pompey's naval power in Sicily posed a continuing threat. Control of grain shipments was crucial. Rome's population relied heavily on imported wheat from Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt. Interruptions led to rising prices and anxiety. Octavian recognized that securing maritime routes was as important as commanding legions on land. Agrippa undertook comprehensive naval reforms. He developed new harbours, such as the Portus Julius near Naples, designed for training and rapid deployment. Sailors were drilled intensively. Ship designs were adapted for ramming and boarding tactics suited to Mediterranean conditions. These efforts required investment and patience, but gradually strengthened Octavian's position. The Pact of Misenum in 39 BCE temporarily eased tensions with Sextus Pompey, restoring grain supply in exchange for recognition of certain territories. For a time, Rome experienced relative calm. Markets stabilized. Public festivals resumed with greater confidence. The Triumvirate appeared functional, though underlying rivalries persisted. Octavian's personal life reflected political strategy. He divorced and remarried in accordance with shifting alliances. His marriage to Livia Drusilla in 38 BCE proved significant. Livia, already mother to 2 sons, brought with her connections to influential families. She would remain a steady presence in Octavian's household, advising discreetly and managing domestic affairs with efficiency. In Rome, architectural and cultural projects began to reflect aspirations toward renewal. Temples were repaired, public buildings were maintained. Though resources were still directed primarily toward military needs, Octavian understood the importance of visible improvement in the capital. Citizens associated stability with well-maintained infrastructure. In the east, Antony's engagement with Cleopatra deepened. He relied on Egypt's wealth to finance campaigns against Parthia and to stabilize eastern provinces. Ceremonies in Alexandria presented Cleopatra and their children in regal contexts. News of these events reached Rome through merchants and envoys. While some reports were exaggerated, they fueled perceptions that Antony embraced Eastern monarchic customs. Octavian's approach to this information was measured. He avoided immediate confrontation. Instead, he reinforced his own image as guardian of Roman traditions. He emphasized his connection to Italy, his fulfillment of veterans' promises, and his respect for religious rites. Through coinage and public messaging, he highlighted themes of duty and continuity. By 36 BCE, conflict with Sextus Pompey resumed decisively. Agrippa's fleet achieved victories that neutralized Pompey's naval advantage. Sextus fled and was eventually executed in the east. Lepidus attempted to assert greater authority in Sicily but was sidelined by Octavian, who effectively removed him from political power while preserving his religious office. The triumvirate structure narrowed to a rivalry between Octavian and Antony. With the western Mediterranean secure, Octavian consolidated his administration. Provincial governors were appointed with attention to loyalty and competence. Tax collection systems were refined. Communication routes were improved. Stability in the West strengthened his base. Public sentiment in Italy increasingly favoured peace. Years of civil conflict had exhausted many families. Merchants desired predictable trade conditions. Farmers sought assurance that land would not be confiscated again. Octavian positioned himself as the leader most capable of delivering such stability. Antony's Eastern focus and association with Cleopatra created a cultural contrast. Roman identity had long emphasized discipline and restraint. The imagery of Eastern courts, though politically nuanced, could be framed as indulgent. Octavian's supporters began to highlight these differences subtly in speeches and pamphlets. Despite growing tension, open war was delayed. Formal ties still bound the two leaders. Antony had married Octavia, Octavian's sister, creating a family connection intended to preserve harmony. Yet distance and divergent priorities eroded this bond. Within Rome, literary circles flourished cautiously. Poets such as Horace and Virgil found patronage within Octavian's orbit. Their works, while artistic in purpose, also reflected longing for order after prolonged turmoil. Cultural production began to align with political messaging that emphasized restoration rather than revolution. Octavian's administrative style matured further. He reviewed provincial reports methodically, ensuring that local disputes were addressed. He delegated military operations to trusted commanders while maintaining oversight. His health continued to require careful management, reinforcing his preference for structured routine. By the late 30s BCE, the Republic's outward forms remained intact, yet its power centers had crystallized. Two dominant figures commanded vast resources across the Mediterranean. Octavian's consolidation of Italy and the West provided a secure foundation. Antony's eastern campaigns and alliance with Cleopatra created both strength and vulnerability. The Second Triumvirate had served its declared purpose of defeating Caesar's assassins. Its continuation now depended on rivalry rather than unity. Octavian understood that the coming conflict would not be decided solely by battlefield outcomes. Public perception, loyalty of legions, and control of resources would shape the result. As this chapter closes, the stage is set for a decisive transformation. The legal alliance that once united three men had narrowed to two competing visions. Rome stood at the threshold of another confrontation, one that would determine whether the Republic could survive in form, or whether a new structure would emerge under the leadership of the heir to a murder, Philippi and its aftermath. The twin battles fought near Philippi in 42 BCE did more than defeat the men who had struck down Julius Caesar. They closed one chapter of the Republic's internal struggle and opened another that would quietly reshape the Roman world. When the dust settled on the Macedonian plain and the surviving soldiers dispersed to their respective commanders, the question was no longer whether Caesar's assassins would prevail. It was which of the victors would determine Rome's future. The campaign itself had required enormous preparation. Legions were transported across the Adriatic in successive waves. Supply depots were established along the route from Italy into Macedonia. Engineers surveyed terrain suitable for encampments. Roman armies did not move as crowds, they advanced as disciplined communities. Each evening, soldiers constructed fortified camps with trenches and ramparts. Each morning, they dismantled them and marched onward. Octavian observed these routines closely, reinforcing his understanding of the practical foundations of power. At Philippi, Antony took an active role in manoeuvring forces. Octavian, whose health had deteriorated during parts of the campaign, relied on experienced lieutenants. Accounts from later writers describe him recovering in camp while battles unfolded nearby. Whether exaggerated or not, such reports reveal a truth about his leadership style. He did not equate authority solely with personal display on the front line. He delegated where necessary and focused on broader coordination. The outcome was decisive. Brutus and Cassius, facing defeat and unwilling to endure capture, ended their lives. Their deaths removed the principal leaders of the Republican cause. Many of their followers accepted clemency and entered the service of the triumvirs. Others scattered to distant provinces. The ideal of restoring the old republic lost its organized military base. Victory, however, carried new responsibilities. The triumvirs now controlled a vast territory without a shared adversary to unify them. The Mediterranean required administration, tax collection, and defense against external threats. Each commander returned to his assigned region with legions expecting reward. Octavian's return to Italy was marked not by triumphal display, but by administrative urgency. Thousands of veterans required settlement. Land surveys began across the peninsula. Officials measured fields, recorded ownership, and designated parcels for redistribution. The process was systematic yet disruptive. Long-established landowners sometimes found their estates divided. Local communities negotiated compensation or relocation. In rural Italy, the presence of veteran colonists altered social patterns. Former soldiers, accustomed to camp discipline, introduced new agricultural practices and expectations. They built homes in grid-like arrangements, reminiscent of military order. Markets adjusted to supply these new settlements. Trade routes shifted slightly to accommodate emerging centres. Resentment inevitably surfaced. Families displaced by confiscations appealed to magistrates. Some towns resisted, leading to skirmishes and sieges. The Perusine War exemplified this tension. Lucius, Antonius, and Fulvia framed their opposition as defence of Italian rights. Octavian's siege of Perusia ended the conflict but left scars in local memory. Yet he avoided unnecessary destruction, seeking to prevent long-term hostility. The Roman urban population, though distant from rural disputes, felt indirect effects. Grain supply remained steady for the moment, but political rumours spread through baths and markets. Citizens discussed whether peace would endure. Religious festivals continued, offering moments of normality. Temples hosted sacrifices thanking the gods for victory at Philippi. Antony, meanwhile, turned his attention eastward. The eastern provinces were wealthy and strategically significant. Cities such as Ephesus and Antioch had long histories and complex civic structures. Antony needed to secure loyalty while preparing for campaigns against Parthia, Rome's formidable eastern rival. His engagement with Cleopatra intensified during this period. Cleopatra sought stability for Egypt, an advantage for her dynasty. Their alliance was both personal and political. News from the east travelled slowly but steadily. Merchants, diplomats, and soldiers carried accounts of ceremonies in Alexandria, of regional appointments, and of military plans. In Rome, these reports were interpreted through the lens of tradition. Roman elites valued ancestral customs and were cautious of overt monarchic symbolism. Antony's Eastern style, while perhaps pragmatic locally, could be portrayed as excessive from an Italian perspective. Octavian did not respond immediately with hostility. Instead, he focused on strengthening his base. He cultivated relationships with municipal leaders across Italy. He ensured that veteran colonies were integrated into administrative systems. He supported public works in Rome, including maintenance of roads and aqueducts. These actions reinforced his image as guardian of Italian stability. During these years, cultural life began to reflect a longing for order after decades of upheaval. Poets composed verses expressing hope for peace. Households invested in frescoes and mosaics depicting mythological scenes of restoration and harmony. Public baths filled with citizens discussing the latest political developments. The appetite for normalcy was palpable. Octavian's household under Livia's management functioned efficiently. Livia oversaw domestic affairs with discipline, maintaining networks of communication among elite families. Though women did not hold formal office, their influence through family connections was significant. Livia's presence added steadiness to Octavian's personal environment. The naval challenge posed by Sextus Pompey soon returned to prominence. Control of Sicily allowed Sextus to disrupt grain shipments. Rome's dependence on imported wheat made this threat serious. Prices fluctuated, and anxiety spread among urban residents. Octavian recognized that maritime dominance was essential to his authority. Agrippa's naval reforms intensified. Crews trained in coordinated maneuvers. New harbours were constructed to facilitate rapid deployment. Shipbuilders experimented with reinforced hulls and grappling devices. These preparations required resources drawn from taxation and confiscated estates. The administrative machinery of the Triumvirate sustained these efforts. The Pact of Misenum in 39 BCE temporarily restored peace with Sextus Pompey. Grain shipments resumed, markets stabilized, citizens breathed more easily. Yet the agreement was fragile. Distrust persisted, and minor violations reignited tensions. By 36 BCE, conflict resumed decisively. Agrippa's fleet achieved critical victories near Mylae and Naulochus. Sextus Pompey fled eastward and was eventually captured. His removal eliminated a persistent obstacle to Octavian's consolidation of the West. Control of the seas ensured reliable grain supply and strengthened economic stability. Lepidus attempted to assert greater authority in Sicily following Sextus's defeat, but Octavian moved swiftly to neutralize him. Without resorting to bloodshed, he stripped Lepidus of most political power, leaving him only his religious office. The Triumvirate effectively became a dual rivalry between Octavian and Antony. In Italy and the western provinces, Octavian continued to refine governance. Provincial administrators were appointed with attention to competence and loyalty. Tax systems were standardized. Infrastructure improvements facilitated communication. The western Mediterranean enjoyed increasing stability under his oversight. Antony's position in the east grew more complex. His campaigns against Parthia met with mixed success. His alliance with Cleopatra deepened. He recognized her children in ceremonial contexts, distributing territories among them. These actions, intended to secure eastern alliances, were viewed skeptically in Rome. Octavian's supporters quietly emphasized the contrast between Italian moderation and eastern pageantry. The Roman populace, fatigued by years of conflict, gravitated toward promises of lasting peace. Octavian framed his leadership as restoration rather than innovation. He declined certain honours that might suggest kingship. He maintained republican offices even as he guided outcomes. This approach reassured those wary of overt monarchy. By the late 30s BCE, the Mediterranean was effectively divided between two power centres. Octavian controlled Italy, Gaul, Spain, and Africa. Antony governed the eastern provinces and maintained ties with Egypt. Formal cooperation persisted, but underlying competition intensified. Public messaging became increasingly important. Coinage, issued by Octavian, emphasized themes of stability and duty. Festivals sponsored in Rome celebrated traditional deities. Infrastructure projects were publicized as evidence of responsible stewardship. In contrast, reports of Antony's activities in Alexandria were framed to highlight cultural divergence. The legacy of Philippi thus extended beyond the battlefield. The elimination of Brutus and Cassius had removed one faction, but it had also narrowed the field to two dominant leaders. Octavian emerged from this period more experienced and more secure. He had navigated land settlements, suppressed rebellions, secured maritime routes, and sidelined Lepidus. The Roman Republic still existed in name, yet its structure was evolving. The forms of office and senate remained, but their function increasingly aligned with the authority of powerful individuals. Octavian's careful integration of power within these forms distinguished him from earlier dictators. As this section draws to a close, the aftermath of Philippi reveals a man refining his approach. He had survived the turbulence of inheritance and civil war. He had learned to balance firmness with moderation. The stage was set for the final confrontation with Antony, a conflict that would determine not merely personal supremacy, but the very framework of Roman governance, dividing the empire. After the defeat of Sextus Pompey and the quiet removal of Lepidus from meaningful power, the Mediterranean world stood effectively divided between two men. Octavian governed the West, Italy, Gaul, Spain and Africa, while Mark Antony directed affairs in the East, from Greece to Syria and Egypt. This division was not merely geographical. It reflected contrasting political styles, administrative priorities, and cultural associations that would gradually influence Roman opinion. In Italy, Octavian's authority rested on a foundation of veterans' loyalty, stabilized grain supply, and steady administration. The peninsula, though scarred by years of civil conflict, was beginning to experience a measure of calm. Roads were repaired to facilitate communication between towns and military posts. Provincial governors in the west reported regularly to Rome, transmitting information about tax collection, local disputes, and frontier conditions. The rhythm of governance, once disrupted by war, resumed with renewed order. The Roman capital itself showed signs of cautious renewal. Markets operated with greater confidence as grain shipments from Sicily and Africa arrived predictably. Public baths were filled each afternoon with merchants, artisans, and officials exchanging news. Temples were cleaned and restored. Though large-scale monumental building would come later, maintenance of existing structures conveyed a message of continuity. Octavian devoted attention to legal procedures. Cases were heard in courts without overt interference. Magistrates were allowed to fulfill their duties within established forms. He did not abolish republican offices. Instead, he worked through them. This approach reassured senators and equestrians who feared the abrupt erasure of tradition. It also reinforced his image as custodian rather than destroyer of Rome's institutions. In the countryside, veteran colonies matured into settled communities. Fields once disputed now yielded crops under organized management. Veterans adapted from military to agricultural routines. Markets emerged near these colonies, linking them to broader trade networks. Over time, these communities formed a stable social base loyal to Octavian's leadership. Meanwhile, in the east, Antony managed territories that were wealthier but more diverse. Cities such as Athens, Antioch, and Alexandria possessed distinct civic identities and long-standing traditions. Antony's task involved balancing Roman authority with local autonomy. He conducted campaigns against Parthia and negotiated alliances with regional rulers. The scale of these operations required substantial financial resources, which Egypt provided. Antony's partnership with Cleopatra was both strategic and personal. Cleopatra sought to preserve Egypt's independence and influence in a Roman-dominated world. Antony recognized Egypt's wealth and geographic importance. Their alliance strengthened his eastern position but complicated his standing in Italy. Reports of ceremonies in Alexandria, where Cleopatra and her children were presented with royal titles, reached Rome through merchants and envoys. These events were interpreted differently depending on political allegiance. Octavian observed developments carefully. He did not immediately confront Antony, nor did he publicly condemn his actions. Instead, he focused on reinforcing his own authority. He ensured that Italian municipalities received attention from Rome. He maintained communication with provincial governors in Gaul and Spain, emphasizing stability and order. His correspondence was systematic, reinforcing loyalty through consistent oversight. Public opinion in Rome was shaped not only by official announcements but by conversation. In workshops and baths, citizens discussed rumours from the east. Some admired Antony's boldness. Others worried about perceived Eastern influence. Roman identity had long been defined in contrast to monarchies of the East. Though Roman generals had adopted certain Hellenistic customs over time, overt symbolism associated with kingship remained sensitive. Octavian's response was measured. He sponsored festivals honouring traditional Roman gods. He emphasized his Italian roots and his commitment to ancestral rites. In coinage and inscriptions, themes of duty and continuity were highlighted. These messages travelled across provinces, reinforcing a consistent narrative. Agrippa continued to strengthen the West's military infrastructure. Naval bases were maintained and expanded. Training of legions remained rigorous. While open war with Antony had not yet begun, preparation was constant. Military readiness was both practical necessity and political statement. Within Octavian's household, Livia managed domestic affairs with discipline. She maintained relationships with influential families, reinforcing networks that supported Octavian's position. Though formal power rested with men, elite Roman women shaped alliances through marriage, correspondence, and hospitality. Livia's steadiness contributed to the perception of Octavian's household as orderly and stable. In Rome, cultural life reflected both memory of turmoil and hope for renewal. Poets found patronage in circles associated with Octavian. Literary works began to explore themes of peace and restoration. Public recitations attracted attentive audiences. Artisans decorated homes with scenes drawn from mythology, often emphasizing harmony after conflict. Antony's Eastern administration was equally complex. He reorganized territories, rewarded loyal cities, and prepared campaigns against Parthia. His reliance on Egyptian wealth and his public association with Cleopatra provided him with resources but also exposed him to criticism. Roman envoys travelling east observed differences in court ceremony and reported them upon return. Tensions between the two leaders increased gradually. Antony's marriage to Octavia, Octavian's sister, had once symbolized reconciliation, yet distance and diverging priorities eroded that bond. When Antony sent Octavia back to Rome and remained in the east with Cleopatra, it provided Octavian with a powerful narrative of abandonment of Roman familial duty. Octavian did not rush into open accusation. Instead, he allowed sentiment to mature. He ensured that official documents and public messaging emphasized Roman traditions. When necessary, he highlighted Antony's decisions without overt denunciation. This approach allowed Roman opinion to shift organically. Administrative reforms in the West continued steadily. Tax collection became more predictable. Local disputes were addressed promptly. Provincial elites were incorporated into Roman governance through honours and appointments. By integrating diverse communities into the administrative structure, Octavian strengthened loyalty without overt coercion. The Roman army in the West benefited from consistent pay and organisation. Soldiers valued reliability. Octavian avoided unnecessary campaigns, focusing on securing frontiers and maintaining readiness. His style contrasted with Antony's more ambitious eastern expeditions. As the 30s BCE progressed, the division between East and West hardened into rivalry. Formal agreements between Octavian and Antony were renewed and then strained. Accusations circulated regarding territorial allocations and authority. The Senate observed these developments with apprehension, aware that another civil war would devastate Italy. Public sentiment in Rome increasingly leaned toward Octavian. His presence in Italy, his attention to civic order, and his careful adherence to tradition appealed to citizens weary of instability. Antony's extended residence abroad, though strategically motivated, distanced him from the Italian base of power. By 32 BCE, the alliance effectively collapsed. Antony divorced Octavia formally and intensified his association with Cleopatra. Octavian responded by publicizing Antony's alleged intentions to transfer the capital eastward and to favour Cleopatra's children in succession. Whether exaggerated or not, these claims resonated with Roman anxieties. The Senate declared war not directly on Antony but on Cleopatra, framing the conflict as defence of Rome against foreign influence. This legal manoeuvre allowed Octavian to present himself as defender of Roman values rather than aggressor in personal rivalry. Preparations for confrontation accelerated. Fleets were assembled, legions were mobilized, supply chains were organized meticulously. Agrippa's naval expertise became central once more. The focus shifted toward the Ionian Sea, where decisive engagement would likely occur. Throughout these developments, daily life in Rome continued. Markets opened at dawn. Citizens attended games and religious observances. Children learned their letters, yet beneath routine lay anticipation. The outcome of the impending conflict would determine whether Rome remained divided or united under a single authority. Octavian approached the coming struggle with characteristic restraint. He avoided extravagant declarations. He emphasized necessity and duty. His preparation was comprehensive, ensuring that resources, alliances, and public opinion aligned. The division of the empire, once a practical arrangement among allies, had become a defining feature of late Republican politics. Now it would be tested. The next chapter would not only resolve a rivalry, but shape the structure of governance for generations. Octavian stood ready, having consolidated the West and cultivated the support of Italy. The heir to a murdered dictator was poised to confront the last major obstacle to undisputed authority: Rome at home. As preparations for open conflict with Antony advanced quietly behind the scenes, life within Rome itself settled into a pattern that would prove decisive. Power was not secured only on distant seas or battlefields. It was rooted in the daily rhythms of the capital, the expectations of its citizens, the loyalty of its elites, and the steady functioning of its institutions. Octavian understood that Rome had to feel governed before it could accept being ruled. The city in the 30s BCE was vast and uneven. Narrow streets wound between tall apartment blocks where families lived in rented rooms stacked above workshops and shops. At street level, merchants sold bread, olives, dried fish, wine, and cloth. The smell of cooking and livestock mingled with incense drifting from nearby shrines. Water poured continuously from public fountains fed by aqueducts that crossed the countryside in long stone arcs. The city was noisy, crowded, and always in motion. Octavian did not attempt to withdraw from this environment. He made appearances in public spaces, attended religious ceremonies, and presided over games. These events were more than entertainment. They affirmed continuity with Rome's past. When magistrates conducted sacrifices before large gatherings, citizens were reminded that divine favour and civic order were intertwined. Octavian's presence signalled that leadership respected these customs. He paid careful attention to grain distribution. The annona, Rome's grain supply system, required coordination across sea and land. Ships from Sicily and Africa docked at Ostia, where grain was unloaded and transported upriver. From storage warehouses, it was distributed to citizens eligible for rations. Interruptions in this system had historically caused unrest. Under Octavian's watch, shipments arrived reliably. The predictability itself built confidence. Public works, though not yet monumental in scale, were maintained diligently. Roads were resurfaced, bridges were inspected, drainage channels were cleared to prevent flooding from the Tiber. Such tasks were rarely celebrated in speeches, yet they shaped daily experience. Citizens walking along repaired pavements or crossing sturdy bridges associated physical stability with political order. Octavian also cultivated relationships with the Senate. He allowed debates to proceed and proposals to be discussed. While he influenced outcomes through alliances and persuasion, he avoided humiliating senators publicly. This approach contrasted with the perception that Caesar, in his final months, had accumulated honours too quickly. Octavian's moderation reassured those anxious about losing status. Within elite households, dinner conversations increasingly reflected cautious optimism. Wealthy Romans, who had once hedged their loyalties, now leaned toward Octavian. They valued his presence in Italy and his adherence to tradition. Marriage alliances reinforced these ties. Families with long political histories saw in him a figure who could preserve their influence within a stable framework. In the broader urban population, entertainment remained essential. The Circus Maximus hosted chariot races that drew massive crowds. Supporters of different racing factions cheered with intensity. Gladiatorial games, though sometimes criticized by philosophers, satisfied popular appetite for spectacle. Octavian ensured that such events were funded and organized smoothly. Public enjoyment, when combined with food security, fostered goodwill. Religious observance played an equally significant role. Festivals honoring Jupiter, Mars, and other deities punctuated the calendar. Priests performed rituals with precision. Omens were interpreted carefully before major decisions. Octavian aligned himself visibly with these rites. By participating without extravagance, he signalled reverence rather than dominance. Meanwhile, communication networks extended beyond Rome. Couriers carried letters between the capital and provincial governors. Reports from Gaul described frontier conditions. Messages from Spain detailed mining revenues. Administrative consistency reinforced the impression that the West was functioning as a cohesive unit under Octavian's oversight. In contrast, Antony's extended residence in the East grew more pronounced. He continued to rely on Egyptian wealth and to engage in ceremonies that, while meaningful in Alexandria, appeared distant from Italian custom. Octavian did not need to exaggerate these differences. Simply by remaining in Rome and emphasizing Roman identity, he created a comparison that favored him. Agrippa's preparations for naval engagement continued methodically. Crews trained along the western coast, harbours were fortified, supply depots stocked provisions for extended campaigns. Soldiers understood that confrontation with Antony's fleet was approaching, though official declarations framed the conflict as directed against Cleopatra. This distinction allowed Octavian to present himself as defending Rome rather than attacking a fellow Roman outright. Cultural patronage expanded during these years. Maecenas encouraged poets whose works reflected themes of renewal and civic pride. Literary gatherings in private homes attracted audiences eager for narratives that imagined a peaceful future. Though artistic expression retained independence, it increasingly resonated with the political mood. Octavian's household operated with discipline. Livia supervised domestic affairs efficiently. Visitors to their residence encountered an environment orderly rather than ostentatious. Simplicity conveyed restraint. In a society wary of excess, this image mattered. Legal reforms were introduced gradually. Courts functioned with regular schedules. Magistrates were encouraged to act within defined roles. Octavian avoided abrupt changes, preferring incremental adjustments that reinforced stability. Citizens accustomed to turbulence began to experience predictability. As 32 BCE approached, tensions escalated. Antony's will, allegedly obtained from the Vestal Virgins and publicized by Octavian, was said to include provisions favoring Cleopatra's children and requesting burial in Alexandria. Whether fully accurate or not, the document stirred Roman opinion. The Senate reacted strongly. War was declared against Cleopatra, not Antony, preserving a narrative of defense against foreign influence. In Rome, public reaction was measured but firm. Citizens gathered in the forum to hear announcements. Religious ceremonies sought divine favour for the coming campaign. Soldiers marched through streets on their way to embarkation points. Families bid farewell to sons and husbands. Though accustomed to conflict, many hoped this would be the final civil war. Octavian continued to frame his leadership as necessary for peace. He avoided inflammatory language. Instead, he emphasized duty to the state and loyalty to tradition. This tone resonated with citizens who desired conclusion rather than escalation. Economic activity adjusted to wartime footing. Shipyards along the coast intensified production. Artisans crafted weapons and equipment. Taxes supported mobilization. Yet Rome itself did not descend into panic. The groundwork of stability laid over preceding years allowed preparation without widespread unrest. The contrast between Rome and Alexandria became a powerful symbol. Rome represented ancestral institutions, Senate debates, and modest leadership. Alexandria, in popular imagination, represented Eastern splendor and monarchical ceremony. This dichotomy simplified complex realities but proved effective in shaping opinion. Octavian's leadership style during this period was consistent with his earlier approach. He consulted advisors regularly. He reviewed reports thoroughly. He avoided dramatic gestures. Soldiers and citizens alike valued predictability. His restraint did not signal hesitation. It conveyed confidence. As fleets assembled and legions prepared to move, the capital remained active yet composed. Markets still opened at dawn. Children still attended lessons. Priests still performed sacrifices. The continuity of daily life reinforced the idea that Rome itself stood steady, even as war loomed beyond its shores. By maintaining order at home, Octavian secured a crucial advantage. When the decisive confrontation occurred, it would not be from a position of desperation, but from one of consolidated strength. The city had become a stable centre, from which authority radiated outward. The heir who had once arrived uncertain and untested now presided over a capital that felt governed. Rome at home was not merely backdrop, it was foundation. The loyalty cultivated in streets, markets, and Senate chambers would sustain the campaign to come. The narrative moved steadily toward Actium, but its outcome would depend as much on the quiet confidence of Rome as on manoeuvres at sea. Antony and Cleopatra. By the early 30s BCE, the political map of the Mediterranean reflected more than territorial division. It embodied two distinct centres of gravity. In Italy and the western provinces, Octavian cultivated the image of a Roman leader grounded in ancestral custom. In the east, Antony's partnership with Cleopatra projected a different kind of authority, one that drew upon Hellenistic court traditions, wealth from Egypt, and expansive regional diplomacy. The contrast between these spheres, though not absolute in reality, became decisive in perception. Cleopatra VII of Egypt was not merely a romantic figure, as later legend would portray her. She was a ruler educated in philosophy, languages, and statecraft. Her kingdom had long balanced independence with accommodation to Roman power. By aligning with Antony, she secured protection for Egypt while providing him with resources essential for eastern campaigns. Grain, gold, and ships flowed from the Nile's fertile valley to support Roman legions operating beyond the Aegean. Antony, for his part, saw strategic logic in the alliance. The eastern provinces required steady financing and local cooperation. Cleopatra's court in Alexandria offered both. The city itself was a centre of learning and trade. Its harbour bustled with merchants from across the Mediterranean. Libraries preserved texts from Greek scholars. Ceremonial life in Alexandria followed patterns influenced by centuries of Ptolemaic rule. Yet what appeared practical in Alexandria could seem troubling in Rome. Reports of ceremonies in which Cleopatra was styled Queen of Kings, and her children were granted territories, resonated differently among Roman audiences. In Italy, where memories of expelling kings shaped political language, such symbolism evoked caution. Octavian's supporters recognized the persuasive power of this imagery. Communication between East and West flowed through letters, envoys, and traders. Stories were told and retold, sometimes embellished. Antony's residence in Alexandria and his absence from Rome created a physical and symbolic distance. His divorce from Octavia, Octavian's sister, and renewed commitment to Cleopatra provided material for criticism framed around family duty and Roman identity. Octavian did not confront Antony through dramatic denunciations. Instead, he allowed public sentiment to evolve. The publication of Antony's will, said to include requests for burial in Alexandria and recognition of Cleopatra's children, intensified suspicion. Whether entirely accurate or not, the document's contents aligned with anxieties already present. The Senate responded by declaring war against Cleopatra, presenting the conflict as defense of Rome against foreign monarchy rather than as another civil war. In Rome, preparations advanced with disciplined urgency. Agrippa coordinated naval forces with precision. Ships were outfitted for maneuverability and endurance. Crews trained in coordinated tactics designed to counter the heavier vessels reportedly used by Antony and Cleopatra. Supplies were stockpiled along Italy's southern coast. Octavian maintained his characteristic tone. He avoided overt triumphalism. In speeches, he emphasized protection of Roman traditions and defense of Italy. Religious rites were observed carefully before departure of fleets. Priests consulted omens, reinforcing the sense that the campaign aligned with divine favor. Meanwhile, Antony assembled forces in the east. His fleet, bolstered by Egyptian ships, gathered near the western coast of Greece. Cleopatra accompanied him, bringing not only resources but personal presence. Their camp represented a coalition of Eastern allies, each contributing troops and ships. The scale of mobilization reflected seriousness of intent. The Ionian Sea became the stage for impending confrontation. Coastal towns watched fleets pass with apprehension. Fishermen and merchants adjusted routes to avoid military zones. Governors in nearby provinces ensured that supply lines remained open. In Rome, daily life continued under the shadow of expectation. Markets functioned normally. Public games were held, yet conversations returned frequently to the coming engagement. Families with sons in the fleet visited temples more often. The city's stability, carefully maintained by Octavian, contrasted with the uncertainty beyond its horizon. Octavian's approach to the campaign reflected his broader leadership style. He relied heavily on Agrippa for naval strategy. Agrippa's experience and practical intelligence guided fleet movements. Octavian focused on maintaining morale and political cohesion. His presence among troops reinforced continuity with earlier victories. As fleets manoeuvred near Actium in 31 BCE, tension was steady rather than theatrical. Weeks of positioning preceded the decisive engagement. Supplies were rationed carefully. Commanders evaluated winds and currents. Roman naval warfare required coordination of ramming maneuvers and boarding actions. Training undertaken in preceding years now proved essential. When battle commenced, Agrippa's tactics disrupted Antony's formations. The engagement unfolded over hours rather than moments. Cleopatra's ships eventually withdrew, and Antony followed. The remaining forces lost cohesion. Octavian's fleet secured control of the sea. The aftermath of Actium did not involve immediate dramatic proclamations. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt. Octavian consolidated his position methodically. He ensured that captured ships and supplies were accounted for. Communications were sent to Rome announcing victory framed as defence of the Republic. In Italy, news of success was received with relief. Citizens gathered in public spaces to hear official reports. Religious ceremonies offered thanks. Markets responded with renewed confidence. The sense that a long cycle of civil war was nearing its conclusion took hold gradually. Octavian did not rush eastward in pursuit. He advanced carefully, securing territories along the way. Provinces previously aligned with Antony declared loyalty to him. Governors sought confirmation of their positions. Administrative continuity was emphasized to prevent disruption. By 30 BCE, Octavian reached Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra, facing defeat and unwilling to endure humiliation, ended their lives. Egypt was incorporated into Roman control, its wealth redirected through new administrative channels. Octavian treated Egypt uniquely, reserving it as a personal domain under imperial oversight rather than senatorial governance. The conclusion of the conflict removed the last rival of comparable stature. For the first time in decades, Rome was not divided among competing commanders. Legions answered to a single leader. The Mediterranean, from Spain to Syria, lay under unified direction. Yet Octavian's challenge had only begun. Victory at Actium secured dominance, but it did not define structure. Rome still valued republican forms. Senators remained cautious. Citizens remembered earlier upheavals. Octavian needed to transform personal supremacy into lasting governance. He returned to Rome not as a conqueror proclaiming kingship, but as a leader presenting himself as restorer of peace. He celebrated triumphs according to tradition. He honoured temples and deities. He emphasized that extraordinary powers had been necessary but would not disrupt ancestral customs. The story of Antony and Cleopatra thus concluded not merely with their deaths, but with the consolidation of Octavian's authority. The contrast between Rome and Alexandria, between Italian moderation and Eastern pageantry, had shaped public perception decisively. Octavian emerged as sole leader, yet he remained cautious about how that leadership would be expressed. As the Mediterranean entered a new phase, citizens across provinces sensed change. Trade routes reopened with confidence. Governors awaited instructions from a single source. Soldiers anticipated settlement or reassignment under unified command. The narrative now turns from rivalry to reconstruction. The heir to a murdered dictator, once navigating uncertainty among seasoned generals, stood at the threshold of a new political order. The question was no longer whether he would lead, but how he would define leadership in a society shaped by centuries of republican tradition. The road to Actium. The victory at Actium in 31 BCE was the result of months of preparation, years of positioning, and decades of political evolution within Rome itself. It did not arise from a sudden burst of decision, but from a steady narrowing of options that left two leaders facing one another across a divided Mediterranean. By the time fleets gathered along the western coast of Greece, the structure of Roman politics had already shifted profoundly. After the Senate's declaration of war against Cleopatra in 32 BCE, mobilization proceeded methodically. Octavian avoided framing the conflict as a civil war. Instead, official language emphasized defense of Rome against foreign domination. This distinction mattered deeply in a society that remembered earlier internal bloodshed with unease. By directing hostility toward Cleopatra, Octavian preserved the image of Antony as a Roman led astray rather than as a domestic enemy. In Italy, preparations were visible but orderly. Shipyards along the western coast intensified construction and repair of vessels. Timber from inland forests was transported by cart and river to coastal workshops. Skilled craftsmen reinforced hulls and fitted rams, designed to strike enemy ships below the waterline. Crews trained in synchronized rowing, learning to maneuver large vessels with precision in narrow waters. Agrippa oversaw naval strategy with practical focus. He selected Actium, near the entrance to the Ambracian Gulf, as a strategic location. Control of this narrow channel would restrict Antony's movements and allow Octavian's fleet to dictate engagement. Supply lines were secured in advance. Food, water, and equipment were stockpiled in fortified depots. Soldiers rotated between training and guard duty, maintaining discipline. Rome itself continued functioning without panic. Markets opened at dawn. Merchants traded goods from across Italy. Magistrates heard cases. Public sacrifices were offered for favourable winds and protection of fleets. The sense in the city was one of anticipation rather than alarm. Years of careful administration had stabilised the capital sufficiently that mobilization did not disrupt daily life. Antony, for his part, assembled a formidable fleet with Egyptian support. Cleopatra's resources allowed construction of large, heavily equipped ships. Eastern allies contributed additional forces. Camps were established along the Greek coast. Diplomats moved between regional leaders, reinforcing alliances. The Ionian Sea became a corridor of tension. Coastal towns watched military vessels pass, their sails dark against the horizon. Fishermen adjusted routes. Merchants delayed voyages. Governors in nearby provinces ensured that provisions flowed steadily to respective camps. Octavian's approach remained consistent with his established style. He did not seek dramatic confrontation prematurely. Instead, he allowed time and logistics to favour his position. Disease and supply shortages affected Antony's camp more severely due to the enclosed nature of the Gulf and the strain on resources. Agrippa conducted raids to disrupt supply routes, tightening pressure gradually. Within Rome, public messaging emphasized patience and confidence. Coins issued during this period depicted symbols of victory and stability, rather than aggression. Octavian appeared in modest attire during ceremonies, reinforcing his image as servant of the state. The fleets eventually faced one another on September 2, 31 BCE. The engagement unfolded across hours rather than moments. Antony's larger ships possessed strength but were less maneuverable. Agrippa's tactics relied on mobility and coordinated strikes. Smoke from burning vessels drifted across the water. Signals were relayed by trumpet and flag. Discipline among Octavian's crews proved decisive. As the battle progressed, Cleopatra's contingent withdrew toward open sea. Antony followed. Whether this movement was planned or improvised remains debated, but its effect was clear. Cohesion among remaining forces faltered. Octavian's fleet maintained formation and secured control of the battlefield. The outcome was not celebrated with immediate extravagance. Octavian consolidated his gains cautiously. Captured ships were secured. Prisoners were processed. Communications were sent to Rome announcing success framed as defense of Roman liberty. The narrative emphasized preservation of tradition rather than personal triumph. In Rome, news of victory was received with relief. Citizens gathered in the forum to hear official proclamations. Religious rites offered thanks to Jupiter and Mars. Merchants anticipated reopening of eastern trade routes. Families with relatives in the fleet awaited confirmation of safety. Octavian did not pursue Antony and Cleopatra recklessly. He advanced methodically, securing Greek cities and ensuring loyalty of provincial governors. Many eastern communities, recognizing the shift in power, declared allegiance to him. Antony's position weakened rapidly. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian reached Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra, facing inevitable defeat, ended their lives. Egypt, long a kingdom allied to Rome, was reorganized under Roman control. Unlike other provinces, it was placed under direct authority of Octavian through appointed prefects, reflecting its strategic importance and wealth. The incorporation of Egypt marked a significant shift. Grain from the Nile Valley would now supplement Rome's supply directly under Octavian's oversight. Revenues from Egyptian resources strengthened the treasury. The Mediterranean, from the Atlantic coast to the eastern deserts, lay unified under a single leader. Octavian returned to Rome not as a conqueror proclaiming kingship, but as a victor presenting peace. He celebrated a triple triumph in 29 BCE, honouring victories in Illyricum, Actium, and Egypt. Processions moved through decorated streets. Captured treasures were displayed. Citizens lined the route, witnessing a culmination of decades of conflict. Yet even in triumph, Octavian maintained restraint. He did not adopt regal symbols. He emphasized restoration of order. The Senate conferred honours, and temples were dedicated in thanksgiving. Public works began to expand, signalling a new era of construction and renewal. The road to Actium had been paved, not only by fleets and legions, but by careful cultivation of opinion, stability, and legitimacy. Octavian's victory resolved the rivalry with Antony and Cleopatra, but it also created a new question. How would he structure authority in a state that valued republican tradition, yet had grown accustomed to centralized power? The Roman populace, weary from years of upheaval, welcomed peace. Trade resumed across previously contested waters. Governors awaited directives from a single source. Soldiers anticipated settlement or reassignment under unified command. Octavian stood at a turning point. He possessed unmatched authority. The legions were loyal. The treasury was strengthened. The Senate remained intact but cautious. Citizens desired stability above all. The events leading to Actium had demonstrated his capacity for patience, organization, and disciplined leadership. The next phase would require equal care. Transforming victory into lasting governance demanded sensitivity to tradition and innovation alike. As the Mediterranean settled under unified control, Rome entered a new chapter. The heir, once overshadowed by seasoned generals, had emerged as undisputed leader. The sea that had witnessed decades of conflict now carried merchant ships under calmer skies. The challenge ahead lay not in defeating rivals, but in defining the structure of an order that would endure. Victory at sea. When Octavian returned to Rome after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, he did so at a pace that reflected calculation rather than celebration. The Mediterranean was quiet in a way it had not been for decades. No rival general commanded an independent fleet. No alternative centre of power claimed legitimacy. The Roman world, from Spain to Syria, answered to a single leader. Yet the meaning of this victory depended on how it was presented and integrated into Roman life. In 29 BCE, Octavian celebrated a triple triumph. Processions moved through streets lined with spectators. Soldiers marched in formation. Captured standards and treasures were displayed. The spoils of Egypt, gleaming under the Italian sun, symbolized both conquest and closure. Citizens watched from balconies and rooftops as the procession wound toward the Capitoline Hill, where sacrifices were offered to Jupiter. The triumph was a traditional ceremony, deeply rooted in Roman custom. It affirmed that victory had been achieved within accepted forms. Octavian wore the garb of a triumphator for the day, yet he did not retain regal symbols afterward. The message was clear. This was not the inauguration of kingship, but the culmination of a necessary campaign. The city itself began to change visibly. Years of civil conflict had delayed maintenance and construction. Now resources flowed more freely. Octavian initiated repairs of temples neglected during wartime. The temple of the divine Julius, dedicated to his adoptive father, was completed in the Forum. This structure did more than honour Caesar. It embedded his memory within Rome's sacred landscape and linked Octavian's authority to filial devotion. He also began the process of reorganizing the army. Legions that had fought in prolonged campaigns required settlement or reassignment. Veterans were granted land in established colonies across Italy and the provinces. Care was taken to avoid excessive displacement of existing communities. The objective was integration rather than disruption. The treasury, replenished by Egyptian wealth, allowed for consistent payment of soldiers. Reliability in compensation reinforced loyalty. Soldiers who returned to civilian life carried with them stories of stability rather than grievance. Their satisfaction reduced the likelihood of renewed unrest. In administrative terms, Octavian faced a fundamental challenge. The Republic's institutions remained intact, yet they had been overshadowed by extraordinary powers granted during crisis. To maintain legitimacy, he needed to recalibrate authority in a way that preserved form while consolidating substance. In 28 BCE, Octavian and Agrippa held the consulship together. They undertook a census of citizens, an act symbolically linked to republican governance. By recording property and population, they reinforced the appearance of regular civic procedure. The census also provided practical information for taxation and military organization. Octavian reduced the size of the Senate, removing individuals deemed unqualified or disloyal. This reform, though significant, was presented as restoration of dignity rather than purge. Senators were encouraged to adhere to standards of conduct. The body's prestige was elevated by selective inclusion. Public works accelerated. Construction projects provided employment and signalled renewal. Roads were improved, facilitating trade and communication. Aqueduct maintenance ensured steady water supply. The urban landscape gradually reflected order rather than neglect. Religious reform accompanied administrative adjustment. Octavian revived traditional priesthoods and ceremonies that had lapsed during civil war. He emphasized the importance of ancestral rites. Temples dedicated to long-standing deities were repaired. Participation in religious observance reinforced his image as guardian of Roman tradition. In 27 BCE, a pivotal moment arrived. Octavian announced his intention to relinquish extraordinary powers and restore authority to the Senate and people of Rome. This gesture, carefully orchestrated, reassured those wary of monarchy. The Senate responded by granting him control over key provinces, those requiring military presence for a period of 10 years. These provinces included Spain, Gaul, Syria, and Egypt, regions where legions were stationed. The arrangement preserved republican language while concentrating military authority in his hands. The Senate retained control over peaceful provinces. Octavian accepted the honorific title Augustus, meaning revered or majestic, a term rich in religious connotation but not overtly royal. He also adopted the title princeps, or first citizen, emphasizing primacy within civic structure rather than kingship. This settlement marked the emergence of what historians later called the Principate. It was a system in which one individual held predominant authority while republican forms endured. Augustus avoided titles such as king or dictator. Instead, he accumulated power's tribunician authority, control of legions, influence over appointments that ensured dominance without explicit monarchy. The Roman populace responded with relief and approval. Stability had replaced prolonged uncertainty. Trade flourished under secure maritime routes. Grain distribution remained steady. Public entertainments continued regularly. Citizens experienced governance as predictable rather than volatile. Augustus's household became a model of disciplined conduct. Livia maintained networks among elite families. Moral legislation began to take shape, encouraging marriage and penalizing adultery. These measures reflected a desire to strengthen social fabric perceived as weakened by decades of war. In the provinces, governors appointed by Augustus managed affairs with increased consistency. Roads extended into frontier regions. Communication between Rome and distant territories improved. Military presence along borders deterred incursions without constant campaigning. The memory of Actium remained central to public imagery. Monuments commemorated victory. Coins depicted symbols associated with naval triumph. Yet emphasis shifted gradually from conquest to peace. Augustus presented himself as restorer rather than conqueror. Cultural life flourished under patronage associated with his circle. Poets composed works celebrating Rome's destiny and the return of order. Public readings attracted attentive audiences. Architecture began to reflect a new aesthetic of permanence and harmony. The transformation of Rome from fractured republic to unified polity was not abrupt. It unfolded through careful recalibration of authority and expectation. Victory at sea had removed a rival. Governance at home required more subtlety. Augustus's restraint distinguished his rule. He declined overt extravagance. He walked through Rome with limited escort. He attended Senate meetings regularly. By participating within established structures, he normalized his predominance. The Roman world adjusted gradually to this new equilibrium. Citizens accustomed to elections and debate continued those practices, though ultimate influence rested elsewhere. Provincial elites integrated into imperial administration. Military command remained centralized. Victory at Actium had secured supremacy. The subsequent years secured sustainability. Augustus's leadership style, patient, methodical, attentive to perception, proved suited to this transition. He understood that enduring authority depended less on spectacle than on integration with tradition. As Rome entered what later generations would call the Pax Romana, its foundations lay in the steady consolidation following Actium. The sea, once contested, now carried merchants under protection of unified command. The capital, once anxious, felt governed. The boy who had inherited a name amid bloodshed now held authority unmatched in Roman history. Yet he exercised it with deliberate moderation. Victory at sea was not an endpoint, but a beginning, the moment from which a new political order would take shape within familiar forms. Master of Rome. By the time the Senate bestowed the name Augustus upon him in 27 BCE, the transformation of Rome had already begun to settle into daily habit. Authority had consolidated without an open declaration of monarchy. The civil wars were over. Legions were stationed strategically along frontiers rather than roaming Italy in rivalry. The Mediterranean's trade routes were secure. The Roman world, long unsettled, now looked to one man for direction, yet that man continued to describe himself as the first citizen. The settlement of 27 BCE was carefully structured. Augustus formally handed back extraordinary powers to the Senate and people. In response, the Senate entrusted him with command over provinces requiring military presence. These provinces, Spain, Gaul, Syria, Cilicia, Cyprus and Egypt, contained the bulk of Rome's legions. Peaceful provinces remained under senatorial oversight. On parchment, balance appeared preserved. In practice, control of the army ensured primacy. Augustus avoided regal language. He did not style himself king. Instead, he accepted titles rich in tradition. Augustus carried religious significance, suggesting reverence. Princeps indicated seniority within the Senate. Over time, he accumulated additional powers, including tribunician authority, granting him the right to propose legislation and veto actions. Each grant was framed as temporary or necessary, yet together they formed a durable framework. The city responded to this arrangement with relief. Markets flourished under predictable taxation. Public safety improved as organized patrols reduced street crime. The Senate resumed regular sessions without fear of armed disruption. Citizens experienced governance as stable and continuous. Augustus turned attention to the physical fabric of Rome. He famously remarked that he found the city of brick and left it of marble. While the phrase simplified reality, it captured his ambition. Temples damaged by neglect were restored. The Temple of Mars Ultor, dedicated to Mars the Avenger, rose in the Forum of Augustus. This space combined political function with religious symbolism, linking Augustus's authority to divine favour and to his role as avenger of Caesar. The Forum of Augustus served practical and ideological purposes. Senators met there for certain judicial proceedings. Statues of illustrious Romans lined its colonnades, connecting Augustus to a lineage of civic virtue. The architectural design conveyed permanence and order. Infrastructure improvements extended beyond monuments. Roads radiated outward from Rome, marked by milestones indicating distances to the capital. Aqueducts were maintained and expanded, ensuring reliable water supply. Public baths offered hygienic and social space for citizens of varied classes. Markets operated within regulated structures. Augustus also addressed the army's organization. Legions were reduced in number to a sustainable standing force. Veterans were settled systematically. The establishment of the Praetorian Guard provided a personal protective force stationed near Rome, reflecting new realities of centralized authority. Their presence, though discreet, symbolized a shift toward permanent military structure tied to the leader. Provincial administration became more consistent. Governors appointed by Augustus were accountable for conduct. Taxation systems were standardized, reducing abuses that had plagued earlier decades. Census procedures were extended to provinces, allowing clearer assessment of resources and population. Cultural life flourished under patronage associated with the imperial circle. Virgil composed the Aeneid, presenting Rome's origins as guided by destiny. Horace celebrated themes of peace and moderation. Literature intertwined with political mood, offering narratives that reinforced stability and continuity. Moral legislation introduced by Augustus sought to strengthen family life. Laws encouraged marriage and penalized adultery. While enforcement varied, the intent was clear: to promote social order in a society fatigued by war. Augustus positioned himself as guardian of Roman virtue as well as political stability. Within his household, discipline prevailed. Livia maintained careful oversight of domestic affairs. Augustus himself followed routine habits, rising early, attending to correspondence, presiding over Senate meetings, and consulting advisors. His health remained delicate at times, reinforcing moderation in schedule. The Senate's role evolved subtly. While debate continued, outcomes increasingly aligned with imperial preference. Senators retained prestige and privileges, yet ultimate authority lay elsewhere. This balance allowed elite participation without destabilizing competition. Across the empire, frontiers were secured rather than expanded recklessly. Campaigns in Spain and along the Danube consolidated borders. Augustus preferred consolidation over aggressive conquest. Stability along frontiers reduced strain on resources. Trade networks expanded. Merchants travelled safely between provinces. Ports thrived. Grain from Egypt supplemented Italian supply. Luxury goods from the east flowed into Roman markets. Economic integration reinforced unity under centralized administration. Public ceremonies reinforced connection between leader and people. Games were sponsored regularly. Religious festivals were observed with renewed vigor. Augustus often participated without ostentation. reinforcing his image as servant of the state. The memory of civil war faded gradually. Younger generations grew up knowing only the stability of the new order. For them, the Principate was not innovation but reality. Administrative efficiency replaced factional rivalry as defining feature of governance. Augustus's mastery of Rome lay not in theatrical domination but in sustained integration of authority with tradition. He respected republican forms even as he guided them. He avoided overt tyranny while ensuring obedience. His leadership style, measured, deliberate, attentive to perception, proved suited to a society cautious of extremes. The Mediterranean world entered a period later described as the Pax Romana. While conflicts persisted along frontiers, the core territories experienced relative peace. Roads, aqueducts, temples, and forums embodied this stability in stone. By the early 20s BCE, Augustus stood as undisputed master of Rome, yet he maintained the posture of first citizen. His authority was accepted because it aligned with lived experience. Citizens saw improvements in infrastructure, predictability in governance, and security in daily life. The transformation from fractured republic to stable principate was not announced with a single decree. It unfolded through careful settlements, reforms, and visible commitment to continuity. Augustus's restraint prevented backlash. His patience secured longevity. The narrative moves now from consolidation to refinement. Mastery required maintenance. The empire stretched across continents. Succession remained uncertain. The balance between tradition and centralized authority demanded constant attention. Yet for the moment, Rome rested under steady guidance. The heir who once navigated uncertainty among seasoned generals now presided over an ordered world. Master of Rome not through crown or proclamation, but through sustained integration of power within accepted forms. The first settlement. The settlement of 27 BCE had marked a formal turning point, yet its durability depended on constant adjustment. Augustus had presented himself as relinquishing extraordinary authority, only to receive back from the Senate the powers necessary to govern key provinces. The arrangement was elegant in appearance and effective in practice. But Rome was not static. Institutions accustomed to competition required careful management if they were to coexist with centralized direction. The years following the first settlement were devoted to refinement rather than spectacle. Augustus understood that authority must feel natural to endure. He therefore avoided abrupt expansion of power. Instead, he allowed additional responsibilities to accumulate gradually, each framed as response to necessity. In 23 BCE, a significant moment arrived. Augustus resigned the consulship which he had held repeatedly since the end of civil war. By stepping aside from the annual magistracy, he signalled confidence in the stability of the system. Yet he simultaneously received tribunician power for life. This authority granted him the right to convene the Senate, propose legislation, and veto decisions. It also conferred sacrosanct status, making his person legally inviolable. The arrangement maintained republican forms while reinforcing his central position. Consuls continued to be elected annually. Senators debated and proposed measures. Yet, Augustus possessed the authority to guide outcomes decisively. The balance between appearance and substance deepened. Rome's urban landscape reflected ongoing renewal. The Forum of Augustus expanded civic space. Marble facades replaced aging brick structures. Temples once neglected were rededicated with ceremony. Construction provided employment for artisans, masons, and labourers. The city's appearance communicated permanence. Infrastructure extended beyond Rome. Roads linked distant provinces with greater efficiency. Milestones marked distances, reminding travellers of centralised oversight. Bridges reinforced trade routes. Aqueducts supplied water to urban centres across Italy and Gaul. These projects were not merely functional, they symbolised integration under unified authority. Provincial administration matured. Governors appointed by Augustus were often drawn from the senatorial class, preserving elite participation. Financial officials oversaw taxation with greater consistency. Reports flowed back to Rome, enabling informed oversight. The empire's vastness required delegation, but delegation was structured. Augustus also addressed the military's long-term organization. Standing legions were stationed along frontiers in Spain, along the Rhine, and in the Balkans. Recruitment standards were clarified. Service terms were defined. Upon retirement, veterans received settlement or financial reward from a dedicated military treasury, the aerarium militar, established to ensure consistent funding. This innovation reduced dependence on ad hoc confiscations. Within the capital, the Praetorian Guard's role solidified. Stationed in and around Rome, they protected Augustus and maintained order. Their presence was discreet yet influential. It represented recognition that centralized authority required institutional support. Religious reform continued as well. Augustus assumed the role of Pontifex Maximus in 12 BCE after Lepidus's death. This position placed him at the head of Rome's religious hierarchy. He revived ancient ceremonies and encouraged observance of traditional rites. Festivals regained prominence. Temples dedicated to Apollo and other deities were restored. Religion reinforced legitimacy. Moral legislation sought to strengthen family structures. Laws encouraged marriage and childbearing among the elite. Penalties were imposed on adultery and certain forms of immorality. While enforcement varied and criticism existed, the intent was to align social behavior with civic stability. Augustus presented himself as custodian of Roman virtue. Cultural life flourished under sustained patronage. Virgil completed the Aeneid, linking Rome's origins to divine destiny. Horace and Propertius composed poetry reflecting themes of moderation and renewal. Artistic production in sculpture and relief emphasized order, family, and piety. Public monuments incorporated imagery reinforcing Augustus's narrative. Economic activity expanded. Trade routes across the Mediterranean operated under secure conditions. Grain from Egypt flowed reliably. Olive oil from Spain and wine from Gaul reached Italian markets. Merchants benefited from standardized taxation and protection from piracy. Economic integration reinforced acceptance of centralized authority. Augustus's personal habits remained disciplined. He maintained a modest household relative to his power. He attended Senate sessions regularly. He read reports attentively. Though health issues persisted intermittently, he managed them through routine and delegation. His demeanor reinforced perception of measured leadership. Yet the settlement's stability required attention to succession. Augustus had no surviving biological sons. His daughter Julia became central to dynastic planning. Through her marriages to Marcellus, then to Agrippa, Augustus sought to integrate potential heirs into his framework. These arrangements reflected both personal concern and political necessity. Marcellus, Augustus's nephew and son-in-law, appeared promising but died young. Agrippa, loyal friend and capable commander, married Julia and became central to governance. Their sons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, were adopted by Augustus, positioning them as heirs. Public ceremonies emphasized their prominence, familiarizing citizens with the prospect of continuity. The balance between republican tradition and emerging dynastic expectation was delicate. Augustus avoided declaring a monarchy, yet he prepared successors within familial structures. This subtle integration allowed transition without overt rupture. Foreign policy during this period emphasized consolidation. Campaigns in Spain and along the Alpine regions secured borders. Diplomatic arrangements with Parthia resulted in the return of Roman standards lost in earlier conflicts, a symbolic victory celebrated in Rome. Augustus preferred negotiation where possible, avoiding unnecessary expansion. Public ceremonies commemorated achievements modestly. Temples dedicated to peace, such as the Ara Pacis, embodied the message of stability. Relief sculptures depicted family and civic procession, linking imperial household with broader community. As years passed, younger generations grew up under Augustus's rule. For them, the Principate was normal. Elections occurred annually. Senators debated, yet overarching authority remained stable. The memory of civil war faded gradually into historical narrative. The first settlement's success lay in its flexibility. Augustus adapted authority without discarding tradition. He accepted honours cautiously, declining those that suggested monarchy. He allowed republican offices to function, even as he guided outcomes. Rome's transformation was therefore not abrupt but layered. Political structures evolved while maintaining continuity. Citizens experienced governance as steady and predictable. Provincial communities integrated into administrative systems that offered protection and opportunity. By the end of the first settlement's decade, Augustus had established a durable framework. Authority rested securely with him, yet it appeared embedded within tradition. The republic in name persisted. The principate in practice flourished. The heir to a murdered dictator had become architect of an order that balanced innovation with reverence for the past. His mastery lay not in spectacle, but in patience. The first settlement set the foundation for decades of relative peace and stability. As the narrative continues, attention turns to the challenges of succession and personal loss that would test even this carefully constructed system. For now, Rome stood unified under a structure that felt both familiar and new, a testament to measured transformation rather than abrupt revolution. Augustus and the new order. By the closing years of the 1st century BCE, Augustus's authority no longer depended on memory of Actium or on comparison with Antony. A new generation had grown to adulthood under his guidance. For them, the Republic had always functioned with a leading figure whose influence surpassed others, yet who declined the name of king. The transformation that once seemed delicate now appeared natural. The challenge shifted from establishing control to shaping a durable civic culture. Augustus understood that order required more than military security. It required shared values and visible structure. He therefore devoted increasing attention to codifying norms that would bind Roman society together. The legal reforms introduced during these years aimed not only at governance but at behaviour. Among the most notable were the Julian laws on marriage and morality. Elite Romans were encouraged, even pressured, to marry and produce legitimate heirs. Unmarried individuals faced restrictions on inheritance. Adultery was criminalised formally, subject to legal penalty rather than private retaliation. Augustus presented these measures as restoration of ancestral discipline, arguing that civil war had weakened family structures. Enforcement of these laws was uneven and occasionally controversial. Some senators resented intrusion into private life. Yet, the legislation signalled Augustus's commitment to shaping society according to a coherent vision. Stability in the state, he believed, required stability in households. Public architecture reinforced this message. The Arapacis Augusti, dedicated in 9 BCE, depicted a procession of imperial family members and priests. The reliefs portrayed harmony and continuity, blending religious symbolism with civic representation. Citizens visiting the monument encountered imagery that linked peace directly with Augustus's leadership. The Forum of Augustus became a centre for judicial proceedings, particularly cases involving war and provincial governance. Its colonnades displayed statues of Rome's legendary and historical figures. By situating himself within this lineage, Augustus aligned his rule with tradition rather than rupture. Administrative refinement continued steadily. Provincial governance benefited from clearer divisions between senatorial and imperial provinces. Imperial legates oversaw frontier regions, requiring military presence. Tax collection methods were standardized, reducing exploitation by private contractors. Provincial elites were integrated into Roman citizenship gradually, reinforcing loyalty. The army's structure matured further. Legions were stationed along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, creating buffers against external threats. Service terms were clarified, and veterans' benefits formalized. The military treasury ensured predictable compensation. Soldiers increasingly identified with the stability of the imperial system rather than with individual commanders. Economic integration deepened. Trade routes connected Britain's southern coasts. Gaul's river valleys, and Mediterranean ports. Olive oil from Spain, wine from Italy, and grain from Egypt flowed through markets. Merchants relied on consistent regulation and secure sea lanes. The Mediterranean became less a contested frontier and more a unifying corridor. Religious revival remained central. Augustus restored ancient priesthoods and emphasized traditional festivals. As Pontifex Maximus, he oversaw ceremonies that reinforced civic cohesion. Temples once neglected during civil war were refurbished. Public participation in rituals strengthened identification with the new order. Cultural patronage flourished. Virgil's Aeneid, completed shortly before his death, portrayed Rome's destiny as divinely guided. Horace's odes celebrated moderation and peace. These works resonated widely, shaping collective imagination. Art and literature under Augustus did not merely decorate society, they articulated its aspirations. Augustus's own conduct reinforced his message. He dressed simply in public. He walked through the city without excessive guard display. He attended Senate sessions consistently, speaking with measured tone. His health remained fragile at times, requiring retreat to villas in Campania for recovery. Yet even in absence, governance continued smoothly through established channels. Family remained central to his political planning. His daughter Julia's marriages were designed to secure succession. Her eventual scandal and exile, however, revealed tensions between public morality and private life. Augustus applied his own laws to his family, demonstrating commitment to principle over sentiment. The episode underscored the seriousness of his moral program. Agrippa's death in 12 BCE removed a loyal and capable partner. Augustus mourned privately, yet ensured continuity through appointment of other trusted officials. The system he had built did not rely solely on one associate. Institutionalization of authority provided resilience. In foreign policy, Augustus pursued consolidation rather than reckless expansion. Campaigns in the Alpine regions secured passes into northern Italy. Diplomatic arrangements with Parthia resulted in the return of lost Roman standards, celebrated as symbolic triumph without major war. These achievements reinforced perception of strength tempered by prudence. Urban life in Rome reflected renewed confidence. Construction projects employed thousands. Markets thrived under predictable taxation. Public entertainments continued regularly. The city's appearance shifted gradually toward marble and orderly spaces. The Senate adapted to its redefined role. While ultimate authority rested with Augustus, senators retained honor and participation in governance. Many found stability preferable to rivalry. The memory of proscriptions and civil war discouraged opposition. Augustus's leadership style remained consistent, patient, methodical, attentive to perception. He avoided sudden changes that might provoke anxiety. Instead, he introduced reforms incrementally, allowing society to absorb them. By the first decade BCE, the Roman world had entered a period of relative peace unprecedented in living memory. The Pax Romana was not absolute. Frontier skirmishes persisted. Yet within core territories, trade, law, and culture operated under stable oversight. The new order rested on integration rather than domination. Augustus had woven authority into tradition so thoroughly that resistance seemed unnecessary to most citizens. The Republic's language endured, but its function had evolved. As years advanced, attention increasingly turned to succession. Gaius and Lucius Caesar, adopted sons of Augustus, were presented publicly as future leaders. Their images appeared on coins. They accompanied Augustus in ceremonies. The public grew accustomed to the idea of dynastic continuity, even as republican forms remained intact. The new order was therefore not static but adaptive. It balanced memory of republican liberty with acceptance of centralized guidance. Augustus's restraint and strategic patience allowed this balance to endure. Rome, once fractured by ambition, now experienced coherence. The Mediterranean's diverse cultures functioned within shared administrative structure. Citizens, merchants, soldiers, and senators participated in a system that felt both ancient and renewed. The transformation achieved under Augustus was not the result of sudden revolution but of sustained calibration. Authority, embedded within familiar forms, had become enduring. The heir who once navigated uncertainty now presided over a world shaped by his vision of stability, family, loss, and succession. As Augustus moved deeper into the final decades of his life, the question that gradually overshadowed even architecture and legislation was succession. The structure he had built rested on personal authority, carefully integrated into republican form. It functioned because he stood at its centre. The Roman world was peaceful, prosperous, and administratively coherent, but it had never before tested the transfer of such concentrated power without civil war. Augustus had no surviving biological sons. His marriage to Livia, steady and politically significant, produced no children of their own. His only child, Julia, born from his earlier marriage to Scribonia, became central to dynastic planning. Through her marriages, Augustus sought to anchor continuity within his own bloodline. Julia first married Marcellus, Augustus's nephew. Marcellus was young, well-born, and presented publicly as promising. His presence beside Augustus in ceremonies familiarized the Roman public with the prospect of transition. Yet in 23 BCE, Marcellus died unexpectedly. His death disrupted careful plans and reminded Augustus that even measured governance could not shield against mortality. Augustus then turned to Agrippa, his longtime ally and trusted general. Agrippa married Julia and became not only partner in governance but potential successor. He was granted significant authority, including tribunician power, allowing him to act in Augustus's stead when necessary. The arrangement was practical and reassuring. Agrippa possessed experience, loyalty, and competence. Julia and Agrippa had several children, among them Gaius and Lucius Caesar. Augustus adopted both boys formally, presenting them as his heirs. Their names appeared on coins. They accompanied him in public ceremonies. The Senate acknowledged their status with honours appropriate to their youth. Rome began to imagine a transition that would preserve stability through family continuity. During these years, Augustus divided his time between Rome and the provinces. He travelled to Gaul and Spain, overseeing administration and frontier security. Such journeys demonstrated active engagement rather than distant command. Provincial elites met him in person, reinforcing loyalty. Within the capital, life continued under steady governance. Public works advanced. The Ara Pacis stood as visible symbol of peace. Markets thrived. Religious ceremonies punctuated the calendar. The Pax Romana felt tangible in daily routines. Then, in 12 BCE, Agrippa died. His loss was profound personally and politically. Augustus had relied on him for military leadership and counsel. The system he had built endured, but the absence of his closest associate left a void. Augustus responded by elevating his stepsons, Tiberius and Drusus, Livia's sons from her previous marriage. Both had military experience and commanded respect among legions. Drusus distinguished himself in campaigns along the Rhine. Tiberius demonstrated administrative competence and discipline. Yet Augustus's preference initially remained with his adopted grandsons, Gaius and Lucius. Tiberius, though capable, was not first choice. Political marriages again reshaped alliances. Tiberius married Julia after Agrippa's death, though their relationship proved strained. The death of Drusus in 9 BCE during a military campaign deepened Augustus's burden. Rome mourned a promising general. Monuments honoured his service. The frontier remained secure, yet the loss narrowed the field of succession. Gaius and Lucius grew toward adulthood under public scrutiny. They were introduced to governance gradually, assigned minor responsibilities, and honoured with titles. Augustus sought to ensure they were familiar faces to the Roman populace. In 2 BCE, scandal disrupted the carefully curated image. Julia, Augustus's daughter, was accused of adultery and moral impropriety. Under the very laws Augustus had enacted to enforce social discipline, she faced punishment. Augustus exiled her to the island of Pandateria. The decision was severe and deeply personal. By applying his legislation to his own family, he demonstrated commitment to principle over affection, yet the emotional cost was considerable. The scandal revealed tensions between public morality and private complexity. Roman society observed that even the imperial household was not immune to transgression. Augustus's reaction reinforced his dedication to stability, but it also exposed vulnerability. Tragedy struck again when Lucius Caesar died in 2 CE, followed by Gaius Caesar in 4 CE after injuries sustained during military service. The carefully prepared line of succession collapsed. Augustus, aging and increasingly aware of mortality, faced renewed uncertainty. In response, he adopted Tiberius formally and granted him tribunician power and command authority. Tiberius was experienced, disciplined, and respected by soldiers. Though not Augustus's first preference, he represented continuity and competence. Augustus also adopted Germanicus, son of Drusus, linking the Julian and Claudian lines. This dual adoption created a layered succession plan. Tiberius would assume leadership, with Germanicus positioned as potential successor thereafter. The Roman populace adjusted gradually to these developments. Public ceremonies introduced Tiberius more prominently. Coins bore his image alongside Augustus's. The Senate confirmed his authority in measured steps. The transition was managed with characteristic caution. In his later years, Augustus withdrew periodically to villas in Campania, seeking relief from recurring illness. Yet he continued to review reports and correspond with governors. Administrative structures functioned smoothly, evidence that institutionalization had succeeded. The empire remained stable. Frontiers along the Rhine and Danube were guarded. Trade flowed steadily. Provinces reported minimal unrest. The system Augustus had built proved resilient even amid personal losses. Family remained both strength and vulnerability. Marriages, adoptions, and public presentation intertwined personal relationships with political necessity. Augustus navigated these complexities with steady resolve, though not without sorrow. By the early 1st century CE, Rome had grown accustomed to the idea that leadership would pass within a defined framework, rather than through open contest. The memory of civil war discouraged speculation about alternatives. Stability itself became expectation. Augustus's later years were marked by reflection rather than expansion. He reviewed achievements, commissioned inscriptions summarizing his deeds, and ensured that the record would present his rule as restoration of order. The Res Gestae, inscribed on bronze pillars and disseminated across the empire, outlined his accomplishments in measured language. As his health declined gradually, Augustus prepared carefully for transition. Tiberius assumed increasing responsibility. The Senate adjusted to his presence. The army recognized his authority. The groundwork for succession, though tested by loss, remained intact. Family, loss, and succession defined this phase of Augustus's life. His system endured not because it eliminated uncertainty, but because it integrated adaptation. Personal grief did not destabilize governance. The empire continued to function, trade, worship, and legislate under steady oversight. The boy, once overshadowed by older generals, now approached the end of a long life, having shaped an order that outlived immediate rivals and personal tragedy. His final years would confirm whether the structure he built could survive the absence of its architect. Empire expands. By the time Augustus entered the final decade of his life, the Roman world no longer trembled with internal rivalry. The question was no longer who would rule, but how far and how securely Roman authority would extend. Expansion under Augustus did not resemble the rapid conquests of the late Republic. It was measured, strategic, and often cautious. The empire grew not only through battle but through organization, roads, diplomacy, and steady administrative presence. In the West, Campaigns in Hispania had already secured the peninsula after prolonged resistance from local tribes in the north. These conflicts, especially in the Cantabrian regions, were arduous. The terrain was rugged, and local resistance persistent. Augustus himself travelled to Hispania in the 20s BCE to oversee operations. Though illness limited his direct involvement, his presence signalled importance. Eventually Roman authority prevailed, roads cut through mountains, and forts established lasting control. In Gaul, administration replaced conquest as the primary task. Augustus reorganised the region into provinces, establishing centres such as Lugdunum, modern Lyon, as administrative hubs. Local elites were incorporated into Roman governance, often granted citizenship and positions within municipal councils. Integration reduced resistance and fostered identification with Roman order. Along the Alpine frontier, campaigns subdued tribes that had long controlled passes connecting Italy with northern Europe. Securing these routes was essential for trade and military movement. Fortified posts and roads followed victory. The Alps, once barriers, became corridors. To the north, along the Rhine and Danube rivers, Roman legions established defensive lines. Drusus, Augustus's stepson, conducted campaigns into Germania, pushing Roman presence beyond the Rhine temporarily. He constructed bridges, explored river systems, and established fortified camps. Though his death curtailed these advances, the experience informed later strategy. Tiberius continued operations in the region, consolidating positions rather than overextending. The Rhine frontier became a boundary of stability. Camps evolved into semi-permanent bases, complete with workshops, granaries, and training grounds. Soldiers stationed there developed familiarity with local landscapes and communities. In the Balkans, Roman forces addressed unrest in Illyricum and Pannonia. These regions required attention due to their proximity to Italy and the Danube corridor. Campaigns were methodical. Roads followed legions, linking newly pacified territories to administrative centres. Integration rather than devastation marked Augustus's approach. In the east, Augustus favoured diplomacy where possible. The Parthian Empire remained a formidable counterpart. Rather than pursue large-scale war, Augustus negotiated the return of Roman standards lost decades earlier in Crassus's failed campaign. This achievement, celebrated in Rome, symbolised restored honour without costly conflict. Egypt, annexed after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, occupied unique status. Governed by a prefect appointed directly by Augustus, it was excluded from senatorial oversight. Its grain supply was essential to Rome's stability. Administrative efficiency there ensured consistent revenue and food distribution. Throughout these expansions and consolidations, Augustus maintained a standing army structured for permanence. Legions were stationed strategically, each with defined service terms and retirement benefits. Veterans settled in provinces reinforced Roman culture and loyalty. Military roads facilitated rapid deployment. Economic networks expanded in tandem with territorial security. Trade with India through Red Sea routes increased. Goods such as spices and textiles reached Roman markets. Ports in Gaul and Spain handled cargo from Britain and beyond. The Mediterranean became less a battleground and more an economic artery. Urban development in provinces mirrored Rome's renewal. Amphitheatres, forums and baths appeared in cities across Gaul, Spain and North Africa. These structures were not merely decorative. They introduced Roman civic life into local contexts, fostering shared identity. Augustus monitored these developments through regular reports. Governors corresponded with Rome on taxation, legal matters and local unrest. Census procedures assessed population and resources. Administrative oversight reduced arbitrary governance. Yet expansion carried risk. In 9 CE, a major setback occurred when 3 legions under Varus were ambushed and destroyed in the Teutoburg forest in Germania. News of the disaster reached Augustus in Rome, reportedly causing deep distress. The loss underscored limits of expansion and vulnerability of extended supply lines. Augustus responded with measured adjustment rather than reckless retaliation. Frontier policy shifted toward consolidation rather than further penetration into Germania. The Rhine was reinforced as stable boundary. Military organization was reviewed to prevent similar vulnerabilities. Within Rome, the public absorbed news of Varus's defeat soberly. Religious ceremonies sought reassurance. The event reminded citizens that peace was maintained through vigilance. Yet the empire's core remained secure. As Augustus aged, he travelled less frequently. Responsibilities increasingly fell to Tiberius and other senior officials. Nonetheless, Augustus retained oversight. Reports were reviewed carefully. Decisions were communicated with clarity. The empire by this time encompassed diverse cultures unified under administrative consistency. From Britain's southern shores to Syria's deserts, Roman law and infrastructure shaped daily life. Local traditions persisted, but integration into imperial structure provided stability. Augustus's expansion was therefore not defined by dramatic conquest, but by strategic integration. Territories were secured, roads built, elites incorporated, and trade encouraged. The empire's boundaries were delineated thoughtfully. Rome's citizens experienced the benefits of this expansion through economic prosperity and security. Grain shipments remained steady. Markets offered goods from distant regions. Public works continued. Cultural exchange enriched art and literature. As his life approached its conclusion, Augustus could observe an empire vastly different from the fractured republic of his youth. Expansion had been deliberate, guided by caution and consolidation. The empire did not grow recklessly. It matured under structured oversight. Legions guarded frontiers while administrative systems linked provinces to the capital. Diplomacy balanced warfare. The heir who once navigated uncertainty had become steward of a vast interconnected world. Expansion under Augustus reflected his broader philosophy: stability through measured growth rather than impulsive conquest. The next chapter would turn toward his final years' reflection and transition. The empire expanded under his guidance. Now it would test whether it could endure beyond his presence. The last years. By the time Augustus entered his 70s, the empire he had shaped for more than 4 decades moved according to rhythms he himself had set. Provincial governors reported regularly. Legions guarded the Rhine and Danube. Grain arrived from Egypt with reliable precision. The Senate convened under marble ceilings restored in his name. The Roman world, once unsettled by rivalry and civil war, functioned within a pattern that felt stable. Age brought physical limitations. Augustus had never been robust in health. Periodic illnesses had marked his life from youth. In later years he spent increasing time in Campania, where the climate was milder and the pace quieter than in Rome's crowded streets. Villas overlooking the Bay of Naples offered respite. Yet even in retreat he remained engaged. Letters arrived daily from provincial administrators. Reports were read carefully. Decisions were issued with measured clarity. Tiberius, formally adopted and invested with tribunician power and proconsular authority, assumed greater public responsibility. He commanded legions, oversaw frontier security, and presided in Augustus's absence. Though their relationship was not without strain, Tiberius demonstrated discipline and competence. Soldiers respected his experience. Senators adjusted gradually to his prominence. Germanicus, the son of Drusus and nephew of Tiberius, also gained visibility. Young, charismatic, and popular among troops, he embodied continuity for many Romans. Augustus's dual adoption strategy had created layered succession, minimizing uncertainty. In Rome, daily life continued under the established order. The Forum of Augustus bustled with legal proceedings. The Aura Passes stood serene along the Campus Martius, its reliefs reminding passers-by of peace secured through measured leadership. Markets operated efficiently. Public entertainments drew crowds without political tension. Augustus devoted time to reviewing his legacy. He composed a detailed account of his achievements, later known as the Res Gestae. The document outlined offices held, wars concluded, temples restored, and funds distributed. Written in straightforward language, it presented his rule as restoration rather than revolution. Copies would be inscribed across the empire, ensuring that his narrative endured. The empire itself faced challenges even amid stability. The Rhine frontier required vigilance following the Varian disaster. Tiberius led campaigns to reinforce positions and discourage further incursions. Augustus supported consolidation rather than expansion. The Danube frontier was similarly fortified. In the east, diplomacy maintained equilibrium with Parthia. Trade routes through Syria and Asia Minor flourished. Governors reported steady revenue and manageable unrest. Integration achieved over decades proved resilient. Augustus's personal circle grew smaller as contemporaries passed away. Livia remained constant, offering counsel and overseeing domestic affairs. Friends from earlier decades were gone. The generation that had known the Republic before civil war was fading. Younger senators had grown up under imperial structure, accepting it as normal. In 14 CE, Augustus travelled once more to Campania. His health declined gradually. Tiberius was summoned. Senators awaited news quietly. The transition, carefully prepared, unfolded without crisis. According to later accounts, Augustus asked whether he had played his part well in the drama of life and requested applause. Whether literal or stylized, the sentiment reflected awareness of his long stewardship. He died at Nola in August 14 CE, aged 75. News reached Rome with solemn clarity. The Senate convened to honour him. He was declared Divus Augustus, deified by senatorial decree. His body was carried in procession to Rome, where citizens lined the route. Funeral rites combined tradition with innovation. His ashes were placed in the Mausoleum of Augustus, a monumental tomb he had constructed decades earlier. Tiberius assumed leadership without contest. The Senate confirmed his authority through established procedures. Legions swore loyalty. Provinces acknowledged transition. The absence of civil war at succession was itself testament to Augustus's achievement. In the days following his death, Rome continued its routines. Grain shipments arrived, courts met, markets opened. The continuity he had sought proved real. Institutions functioned without interruption. Augustus's final years thus completed a transformation begun in uncertainty. He had navigated inheritance, rivalry, and reform with patience. He had embedded authority within tradition so thoroughly that its transfer did not fracture the state. The empire he left behind was expansive yet organized, powerful yet stable. Roads connected provinces, legions guarded boundaries, laws governed conduct. Citizens experienced governance as predictable. The boy once overshadowed by seasoned generals had become a figure whose death did not unravel his creation. His life bridged republic and empire, conflict and peace. As the narrative moves to consider his legacy, it does so in recognition that his greatest accomplishment was not merely victory, but endurance. Rome would continue under successors shaped by the system he designed. Legacy of Augustus. When news of Augustus's death spread through Rome and across the provinces in 14 CE, the response was not confusion or immediate unrest, but ceremony. That quiet fact, more than any inscription or monument, revealed the depth of his achievement. For more than 40 years, authority had centred in one man. Now that man was gone, and yet the machinery of governance continued to turn. The Senate met swiftly. Formal rites were observed. Augustus was declared a god, Divus Augustus, by senatorial decree. This act did more than honour memory. It reinforced continuity. By placing him among the divine, the Senate affirmed that his rule had been sanctioned not only by law, but by destiny. Tiberius, his adopted son and successor, accepted power within the framework Augustus had constructed. The legions swore loyalty. Provincial governors confirmed allegiance. No rival general rose in challenge. The feared return of civil war did not occur. The Roman world that Augustus left behind differed profoundly from the one into which he had been born. In 63 BCE, the Republic had been wealthy and ambitious but unstable. Generals competed for supremacy. Elections were turbulent. Armies shifted allegiance. By 14 CE, the empire was unified under a system that combined centralized authority with republican form. Magistracies remained. The Senate deliberated. Laws were enacted in traditional language. Yet ultimate direction flowed from the office Augustus had shaped. His legacy was not a crown or throne. It was a structure, the principate, that allowed one individual to guide policy while preserving the appearance of collective governance. This structure proved durable. Emperors after Augustus would modify it, expand it, or strain it, but they operated within parameters he defined. Titles such as princeps and imperator became standard. The Senate's role, though diminished in power, endured as part of the system. Architecturally, Augustus transformed Rome's appearance. Temples restored under his direction stood for generations. The Forum of Augustus remained a judicial and symbolic centre. The Ara Pacis continued to proclaim peace through carved procession. The mausoleum he built housed his ashes and those of family members, becoming a visible landmark of continuity. Beyond Rome, infrastructure projects unified the empire. Roads linked distant provinces, facilitating trade and communication. Aqueducts carried water into cities across Italy and Gaul. Military forts along frontiers anchored Roman presence. These physical networks supported cultural and economic integration long after his death. Economically, Augustus's reign fostered stability that encouraged growth. Secure sea lanes allowed merchants to travel without fear of piracy. Grain from Egypt fed Rome's population reliably. Trade extended to India and beyond, bringing exotic goods into Roman markets. Standardized taxation and administrative oversight reduced exploitation, encouraging provincial prosperity. Culturally, his patronage shaped Roman identity. The literature of Virgil, Horace, and others articulated themes of destiny, order, and renewal. These works became part of educational curriculum for generations. Art and sculpture reflected a style emphasizing harmony and civic virtue. Augustus's image, reproduced in marble across the empire, conveyed youth and calm authority. Religiously, his revival of traditional rites strengthened civic cohesion. By assuming the role of Pontifex Maximus, he integrated political and religious leadership. Festivals regained prominence. The imperial cult, honouring Augustus and later emperors, developed as a means of expressing loyalty across diverse provinces. Militarily, his reforms created a professional standing army with defined service terms and retirement benefits. This system reduced reliance on personal loyalty to individual generals. The aerarium militar ensured consistent funding. Frontier policy emphasized consolidation rather than reckless expansion, though later emperors would test boundaries. Perhaps most significant was the psychological transformation he achieved. Romans who had lived through proscriptions and shifting alliances experienced a long stretch of relative peace. Younger generations grew up knowing no alternative system. Stability became expectation rather than aspiration. Augustus's personal qualities shaped this legacy. He was not the most flamboyant commander nor the most dramatic orator. His strength lay in patience, calculation, and sensitivity to perception. He understood that overt monarchy would provoke resistance. Instead, he embedded authority within familiar institutions. He declined titles that suggested kingship. He attended Senate meetings, respected rituals, and presented himself as servant of the state. His handling of succession, though marked by tragedy and loss, ultimately prevented civil war. By preparing Tiberius gradually and integrating him into governance before his death, Augustus ensured continuity. The peaceful transition in 14 CE validated decades of preparation. Yet his legacy was not without tension. The moral legislation he enacted revealed friction between public ideal and private life. The exile of Julia exposed complexity within his own household. Frontier setbacks such as the Varian disaster demonstrated limits of control. The Principate depended heavily on the character of its ruler. Future emperors would test the resilience of the system. Still, the framework endured. The Pax Romana, a period of relative stability lasting roughly 2 centuries, rested on foundations he laid. Trade flourished, cities expanded. Law developed in sophistication. Roman citizenship gradually extended to broader populations, culminating centuries later in universal grant. When citizens in distant provinces swore loyalty to subsequent emperors, they did so within structures Augustus created. When soldiers marched along roads linking Rhine to Rome, they followed routes maintained under his authority. When senators debated beneath marble colonnades, they participated in a system balanced between tradition and centralized guidance. The boy named Octavian, once overshadowed by seasoned generals and navigating inheritance amid bloodshed, became Augustus' revered leader who reshaped Rome without proclaiming revolution. His life bridged republic and empire. He transformed rivalry into order through measured reform rather than abrupt overthrow. As evening settles over this long journey, it is worth pausing on the quietness of his final achievement. Not the spectacle of Actium, nor the marble of temples, but the absence of chaos at his death. The empire did not fracture. Legions did not march against one another. Citizens did not flee in fear. Governance continued. In that continuity lay his enduring success. The Mediterranean, once fractured by ambition, moved under steady administration. Roads carried merchants rather than armies. Temples echoed with ritual rather than alarm. The Senate convened within a structure it had helped construct. Rome, ancient and adaptive, entered a new age. And so the life of Augustus concludes not with dramatic collapse, but with sustained order. His story is one of transformation through patience, authority woven into tradition, and ambition tempered by restraint. As the lamps dim in Rome and the murmur of its streets softens, the empire he shaped continues into the night steady, expansive, and enduring.